Somewhere in the ancient world, thousands of years before anyone had ever heard of a bank, a bailout, or a business cycle, someone wrote down a law that sounds almost impossible. Every 50 years, the text says, everything stops. Debts vanish. Enslaved people go free. Land that was sold or lost returns to the families who once called it home. The entire economic and social machinery of a nation grinds to a halt, resets to zero, and starts over. Not as punishment, not as revolution, as law, as something built into the very structure of how a society was supposed to function. This is the Jubilee, and if you've never really looked into it, the idea is almost too strange to believe anyone took it seriously. A society that periodically wipes its own economic slate clean on purpose by design, written into its most sacred texts. Not a collapse, not a war, a scheduled reset. But here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where this story stops being a Bible trivia footnote and starts becoming something much bigger. Was the Jubilee ever actually practiced? Or was it always just an ideal, a beautiful piece of theology that ancient Israelites read about, admired, and then quietly ignored for centuries? And even more intriguingly, did this 50-year pattern of release and renewal leave fingerprints on history far beyond the ancient Near East? Some researchers, historians, and pattern seekers have spent years asking whether 50-year intervals show up again and again across centuries, in debt crises, in political upheavals, in moments when societies seem to hit a wall and something has to give. Is that a real historical rhythm? Or is it just our brains doing what brains do, finding patterns in noise, because patterns feel safer than chaos? That's the question we're going to sit with today. And to answer it, we're going to travel a long way. We'll start in the book of Leviticus, digging into the actual words, the actual legal language that first described this 50-year cycle. We'll figure out why 7 times 7 became 50, and why that math actually matters more than you'd think. We'll uncover the Sabbatical year, the quieter 7-year cousin of Jubilee that most people have never heard of. We'll look at land, inheritance, debt, and slavery, and what it meant for an ancient society to legally declare that no one could be poor forever, and no one could be rich forever either. We'll ask whether ancient Israel ever actually did any of this. We'll follow the trail through the prophets, through exile, through the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, where Jubilee became something even stranger, tied to angels and cosmic calendars. And then we'll widen the lens even further. Ancient Near Eastern debt cancellations that predate the Bible. Roman holy years, medieval Catholic Jubilees, Reformation politics. Modern economic cycles that some claim echo this same 50-year rhythm all the way into the present day. By the end, you'll have to decide for yourself. Is the Jubilee a genuine historical pattern hiding in plain sight? Or is it a powerful idea that humans have projected onto history again and again, because we desperately want to believe that no matter how bad things get, a reset is always coming? Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right there where you are. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it's honestly wild seeing this show playing at midnight in Tokyo while someone else is starting their morning coffee in Toronto. It's a strange, quiet kind of connection, all of us scattered across time zones, listening to the same ancient story. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, the best way to support what we do here is simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there, and if you like what you hear, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right in the description. Now, let's go back to the source. Let's open Leviticus and see what this 50-year law actually says, word for word. Leviticus 25. That's the address. Right in the middle of what scholars call the Holiness Code, a stretch of laws running from Leviticus 17 through 26, that reads less like a legal document and more like a blueprint for an entire way of life. This isn't tucked away in some obscure corner of Scripture. It sits at the heart of Israelite covenant law, right alongside instructions about sacrifices, dietary rules, and moral conduct. Whoever compiled this text wanted Jubilee sitting shoulder to shoulder with the most sacred obligations a person could have. That placement alone tells you something. This wasn't meant to be optional advice. It was meant to be structural. The chapter opens on Mount Sinai, which is itself worth noting. Moses isn't handing down these rules in some administrative meeting back in camp. According to the text, this law comes directly from God on the mountain, the same setting as the Ten Commandments. Whatever you believe about the historical reality behind that claim, the literary framing is doing serious work. It's telling the original audience, and every audience since, that Jubilee carries the same weight as the most fundamental laws in Israelite religion. Don't murder, don't steal, and every 50 years reset the entire economic system. All handed down in the same breath. Now let's get into the actual mechanics, because the math here is deliberate, and it matters. The text instructs the Israelites to count 7 sabbatical years, not 7 years total, 7 cycles of 7 years. 7 times 7. That's 49 years. And then, according to Leviticus 25, 8 through 10, on the 10th day of the 7th month you sound the shofar, the ram's horn, throughout the entire land. This isn't a quiet legal announcement passed around in scrolls. This is loud, public, impossible to ignore. Everyone in the land, from farmers to merchants to the enslaved, hears that horn and knows exactly what it means. And the timing is not random either. The 10th day of the 7th month is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the single holiest day in the Israelite religious calendar. Think about what that pairing does. The day already set aside for national repentance, for wiping the moral slate clean between the people and their God, becomes the exact same day the economic slate gets wiped clean between people and each other. Spiritual reset and financial reset, announced with the same trumpet blast on the same sacred day. That's not an accident of scheduling. That's theology built into economics, or maybe economics built into theology. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Atonement isn't just something you feel. It's something you do, and apparently something an entire society does together all at once, on command. So what actually happens once that horn sounds? Leviticus lays out 3 major commands, and it's worth separating them clearly, because later tradition, and honestly, a lot of modern retellings, tend to blur them together into one big everything cancels moment. That's not quite what the text says. First, liberty is proclaimed throughout the land. Leviticus 25:10 uses this exact phrase, and it's actually the same verse later inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which tells you how deeply this ancient law has echoed through history, even into places you wouldn't expect. But liberty here has a specific legal meaning tied to 2 things: land and labour. Second, ancestral property returns to its original family. This is huge, and it's honestly the beating heart of the whole system. In ancient Israel, land wasn't just an asset. It was identity. Each tribe, each clan, each family had been allotted territory when the Israelites first entered Canaan, and that allotment was considered permanent, sacred, tied to covenant promises. But real life happens. Families fall into debt. Bad harvests, illness, war, misfortune. People sometimes had no choice but to sell their land just to survive. Jubilee says that sale can never be truly final. Land could be sold, essentially leased, for a number of years, but come the Jubilee, it goes back. No family could be permanently landless. No family could permanently accumulate land at everyone else's expense either. The text actually frames land sales as selling a certain number of harvests, not selling the land itself, which is a pretty radical concept if you sit with it. You're not really buying property. you're buying time. Third, certain labourers, specifically fellow Israelites who had sold themselves into servitude due to debt, were released. This is important because it's not talking about foreign slaves, which existed under different rules in this ancient context. And it's not describing chattel slavery like what would later devastate the Americas. This is about debt bondage Israelites working off what they owed to other Israelites. Jubilee said that bondage had a ceiling. No matter how much you still owed, no matter what the original terms were, the 50th year set you free. Now here's a detail that often gets lost. Alongside all of this, Leviticus commands an agricultural rest for the Jubilee year itself. The land is not to be sown. Grappa vines are not to be pruned. Whatever grows on its own you can eat, but you cannot farm the land in any organised commercial sense. This mirrors the Sabbatical year, which happens every 7th year, but Jubilee stacks this rest on top of everything else. And if you do the math, that potentially means the 49th year, itself a sabbatical year, and the 50th year, the Jubilee year, could create 2 consecutive years without normal planting. 2 years of relying on stored grain and whatever grows wild. That's an enormous logistical demand for any agricultural society, ancient or modern. It's one of the reasons some scholars later questioned whether this law was ever fully practical, a thread we're going to pull on much harder later in this video. But here's where we need to slow down and get precise, because popular retellings of Jubilee often oversimplify this into one sweeping idea. Everyone's debts get cancelled, full stop. That's not exactly what Leviticus 25 says. The text is specific about land returning and about Israelite debt servants being released. It does not explicitly say that all commercial debts, all financial obligations between merchants, all loans of any kind, simply vanish into nothing. Later tradition and later interpreters would expand and reinterpret Jubilee in different directions, sometimes broadening it into a more universal debt release, but the original legal text is more narrowly focused. Land returns, bonded countrymen go free. The soil rests. That's the actual command. Understanding that distinction matters enormously for everything we're about to explore. Because once we start looking at whether Jubilee was ever practiced, and once we start hunting for 50-year patterns across world history, we need to know exactly what we're testing against. Not a vague legend of universal financial forgiveness, but a specific, detailed, almost bureaucratic set of instructions handed down in an ancient legal text. So now the question becomes obvious. Why 50? Why not just keep the sabbatical cycle going every 7 years and call it done? Why did 7 cycles of 7 suddenly require 1 more year tacked on top? That extra year is where Jubilee stops being a simple agricultural rule and becomes something much bigger. Because 7 times 7 does equal 49. Everybody knows that. So why does Leviticus move from 49 years to a 50th year? Why not declare the 49th year itself the grand reset? Why count 7 sabbatical cycles and then add 1 more? At first glance it looks like a small math problem. But this tiny question has been argued over for centuries, and the answer changes every attempt to place Jubilee on an actual historical calendar. To understand why, we have to start with the number 7. In the Hebrew Bible, 7 isn't just a number, it's a pattern built into the structure of sacred time. The creation story in Genesis is organized around 7 days. God creates for 6 days, then rests on the 7th. That 7th day becomes the Sabbath, the weekly interruption of ordinary labour. You work, you produce, you build, you worry, you compete. And then every 7th day you stop. Not because the work is finished forever, but because work is not supposed to own you. That idea expands outward. What happens to a person every 7 days happens to the land every 7 years. For 6 years, the farmer sows, prunes, harvests, stores grain, and tries to make it through another uncertain season. But in the 7th year, the land itself gets a Sabbath. No normal planting, no organized harvest, no treating the soil like an endlessly exploitable machine. And then Jubilee takes the same logic and magnifies it again. 7 days leads to 1 Sabbath day. 7 years leads to 1 sabbatical year. 7 sabbatical cycles, 7 times 7 years, lead to something like a Sabbath of Sabbaths, a climax, a release year, a year in which land returns, debt servants go free, and the normal machinery of accumulation is forced to stop and reverse. This is not random arithmetic, it's sacred time built in layers. Think of it almost like a set of ripples moving outward from the weekly Sabbath. First, the individual household has to pause. Then the farm has to pause. Then, after 7 complete cycles, the entire social order has to pause long enough to remember what it was supposed to be. The land belongs ultimately to God. The people belong ultimately to God. The harvest is never entirely the farmer's achievement. Wealth is never entirely the owner's possession. And no economic arrangement, however legal it may look on paper, is allowed to become permanent enough to erase a family's future. That's the theological force behind 50. It isn't presented as a magical number that automatically predicts world events. It is a number created by a ritual pattern, 7 multiplied by 7, followed by a declaration that the cycle has reached its fullness. But then comes the problem. Is Jubilee actually year 50? Or is it another name for year 49? The plain reading of Leviticus seems straightforward. You count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7, reaching 49. Then you consecrate the 50th year. The text says it directly. Count 49 years. Proclaim liberty in the 50th. On that reading, Jubilee is a distinct year after the 7th sabbatical year. And that creates the strange possibility we just touched on. 2 consecutive years of agricultural rest. Year 49 would be a sabbatical year because it is divisible by 7. Then year 50 would be Jubilee, also a year in which the people are told not to sow or reap normally. Imagine what that means in practical terms. You are an ancient farming family. You have already entered a year without ordinary cultivation. You are living on reserves, on stored grain, on what grows by itself, on whatever arrangements your community can sustain. Then the next year arrives and the restriction continues. No return to normal farming yet. Leviticus anticipates the anxiety. It has God promised that the land will produce enough in the 6th year to carry the people through the sabbatical period. That promise is not incidental. It tells you the law knows exactly how risky this sounds. A 2-year interruption in planting isn't a symbolic inconvenience. It's a survival question. But not everyone agreed that Jubilee had to be a separate 50th year. Later Jewish interpreters wrestled with the calendar mechanics. Some argued that the Jubilee year overlapped with the first year of the next 7-year cycle. In other words, year 50 was Jubilee, but it also counted as year 1 of the next cycle. That way, the system could maintain a repeating 49-year rhythm instead of creating a 50-year cycle that throws the sabbatical count out of alignment. Because think about what happens if Jubilee is entirely separate. Year 49 is sabbatical. Year 50 is Jubilee. Then year 51 becomes the first year of the next cycle. Count forward another 7 years, and the next sabbatical year falls on year 57. Then 64, then 71. The rhythm still works internally, but the sabbatical years no longer line up with a simple every 7 years count from the original starting point in the way some interpreters expected. If, instead, Jubilee overlaps with year 1, the next sabbatical year comes in year 56, then 63, then 70. The 7-year pattern stays perfectly continuous. Jubilee becomes less like an extra step outside the cycle and more like a hinge between one great cycle and the next. This might sound like ancient bookkeeping. It isn't. This is the question behind almost every confident claim that someone has discovered a Jubilee date. To calculate a Jubilee, you need more than the number 50. You need a starting point. Was the count supposed to begin when Israel entered the land? When the land was distributed among tribes? When the temple was built? After an exile? After a later restoration? Different traditions proposed different anchors, and even if you somehow agreed on the starting year, you would still need to decide whether the cycle is 49 years, 50 years, or a 49-year pattern with an overlapping 50th year. A single disagreement at the beginning can move every later Jubilee calculation. Over centuries, those differences compound. One scholar counts a Jubilee in 1 year. Another places it a year later. Another is off by several years because they use a different calendar system, a different interpretation of the Sabbatical cycle, or a different date for the entry into the land. By the time people start projecting the cycle into modern history, the range can become enormous. And there is another complication. Ancient Israel did not use the kind of fixed, universally standardized calendar that modern people take for granted. Months followed lunar observation. Years had to stay connected to the agricultural seasons. Extra months could be added to keep festivals from drifting out of place. Later Jewish calendars developed more regular rules, but the biblical world itself was not operating with a digital countdown clock that everybody could consult. Sacred time was observed, announced, remembered, and debated. That doesn't make the system meaningless. It makes it human. Real communities had to decide when the year began, when the harvest season counted, when the trumpets sounded, and who had authority to declare the cycle. Jubilee was never just numbers floating in the air. It was a public institution. A calendar only becomes real when a community agrees to live by it. And that may be the deepest point. The Sabbath, the Sabbatical year, and the Jubilee all link worship to material life. They refuse to separate prayer from farming, holiness from debt, sacrifice from property, or religious ritual from the treatment of workers. In this system, time itself becomes a check on power. Every week, the worker rests. Every 7th year, the soil rests. At the great culmination of the cycle, families return, servants are released, and land cannot remain permanently concentrated in the hands of the few. The calendar is doing moral work. It is teaching that society has limits. Limits on extraction, limits on ownership, limits on the right of one generation to lock the next generation into its failures. So why did 7 times 7 become 50? Because 49 marks the completion of the pattern, but 50 marks what comes after completion. Release. Return. A new beginning that can only happen once the old order has been interrupted. That is why 50 should be understood first as theology, not chronology. Before it became a number people tried to hunt for in empires, revolutions, markets, and modern headlines. It was a sacred design. A way of saying that history, land, labour, and wealth should not run forever in one direction. And yet, once a culture gives a number that much symbolic power, people inevitably begin asking a more dangerous question. What if the pattern does run through history? What if 50 years is not only a ritual interval for ancient Israel, but a hidden clock marking the rise and fall of whole societies? Before we can test that claim, though, we need to look at the mechanism Jubilee was built on in the first place. The 7th year, the Sabbatical year, and the astonishing demand that even the land be allowed to rest. But before there can be a 50th year, there has to be a 7th. This is the part people often skip. Jubilee gets the dramatic language, trumpets, liberty, families returning to ancestral land. a whole society hitting pause and reversing course. But Jubilee was not designed to appear out of nowhere once every 50 years. It rested on a smaller, more regular discipline, a reset that came again and again in the life of every farming generation. The biblical name often used for this seventh year is Shemitah. It comes from a Hebrew root connected to letting go, releasing, dropping what you're holding. And that is exactly what the year demanded. For 6 years, farmers worked the land normally. They planted fields, pruned vineyards, gathered olives, stored grain, paid obligations, and tried to make a living in a world where one bad season could change everything. Then the 7th year arrived, and the command was startling. Let the land rest. Leviticus says the people were not to sow their fields or prune their vineyards in the normal way. They could not organize a commercial harvest from crops that grew on their own. What the land produced naturally was not supposed to become another year of aggressive accumulation. It was available for the household, for servants, for hired workers, for resident foreigners, and even for livestock and wild animals. Think about how radical that sounds in an ancient agricultural society. Land was not a background asset. Land was food, income, inheritance, survival. If you had a field, you did not leave it alone because you were feeling spiritually refreshed. You planted because your children needed bread. You harvested because winter was coming. You stored because drought, pests, war, or debt could destroy a household with terrifying speed. And yet the Sabbatical law says every 7th year the farmer must admit something that ordinary agriculture constantly encourages people to forget. You are not in total control. You can work the soil. You can improve it. You can fence it, inherit it, buy rights to its crops, borrow against its future yield. But you do not own the rhythms that make life possible. Rain is not yours. Seed is not yours in the deepest sense. Fertility is not yours. The land can produce, and the land can fail, despite every human plan. This was theology, but it was also ecology. Modern people can recognize part of the practical logic almost immediately. Repeated cultivation can exhaust soil. Leaving fields fallow can interrupt certain pests, preserve moisture, reduce pressure on the land, and allow fertility to recover. Ancient farmers did not need modern soil chemistry to understand that land could be overworked. Anyone who depended on fields year after year could see the difference between healthy ground and tired ground. But the sabbatical year goes beyond crop management. It is not merely an ancient farming technique dressed up as religion. It has a social purpose built into it. In Exodus, the produce of the 7th year is specifically connected to the poor. What grows without normal cultivation is to be left so that those with little can eat. And what they leave behind can feed animals. The boundary around private production becomes temporarily more porous. A field still exists. A household still lives nearby. But the usual line between mine and yours becomes less absolute. For 1 year, the land is treated less like private machinery for generating profit, and more like a shared source of life. That matters because ancient inequality often began with a bad harvest. A family loses grain, then it borrows, then it loses animals. Then it mortgages part of its land. Then perhaps a child, or the farmer himself, enters debt servitude. One crisis becomes a chain of dependency. The sabbatical rhythm does not erase every danger. But it creates an institutional reminder that survival cannot be left entirely to whoever happens to own the most land at a given moment. And then there is the second side of Shemitah, debt. Deuteronomy describes a release at the end of every 7 years. Creditors are told to release what they have lent to fellow Israelites. The exact legal mechanics have been debated for centuries. Did the law require total cancellation of all outstanding personal debts? Did it suspend collection during the 7th year? How did later communities apply it, when people needed loans to keep farming and trading? Those questions matter, but the direction of the command is clear enough. Debt was not supposed to become an endless claim over another person's future, and Deuteronomy knows exactly what a lender might say in response. Imagine you are asked for a loan in year 6. The release year is close. You know that if you lend grain, silver, or seed now, you may not recover everything. So you refuse. You call it caution. You call it responsible lending. You say the timing is unfortunate. The biblical text anticipates that calculation and condemns it. It warns people not to harden their hearts or close their hands simply because the year of release is near. In other words, the law understands the loophole before the loophole is even attempted. That is a remarkably realistic detail. These laws are not written for imaginary saints who never worry about repayment. They are written for people who count risk, protect property, remember old losses, and hesitate when generosity becomes expensive. The sabbatical year therefore put pressure on both sides of the economy. Farmers had to live without a normal cycle of cultivation. Lenders had to accept that some claims could not be pursued forever. Wealthier households were expected to carry obligations toward poorer neighbours. The poor were not simply objects of charity. They had a recognised claim on the spontaneous produce of the land, and in Deuteronomy's vision relief from crushing debt. But Shemitah was still not Jubilee. The 7th year release did not do everything the 50th year was imagined to do. It did not, at least in the clearest Jubilee legislation of Leviticus, trigger the great return of hereditary land to its original family line. It was not the full-scale restructuring of land rights that made Jubilee so politically explosive. It was a recurring interruption, a smaller reset. The rhythm that trained a society to accept the idea that ownership, debt, and productivity all had limits. And there was one huge practical problem. What did people eat? Leviticus does not ignore this. It puts the question directly into the mouths of anxious farmers. If we do not sow or gather in our crops, what are we going to eat? That is not a lack of faith. That is the first question any sane household would ask. The answer is a promise. In the 6th year, God says the land will provide enough blessing to sustain the people through the sabbatical interruption. In the Jubilee framework, the promise becomes even more dramatic because the 6th year produce must carry people through the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, and until the next planted crop can be harvested. Whether every ancient farmer experienced that promise as literal abundance is impossible to prove. The text is not an agricultural ledger. It is law, theology, and vision. But the promise reveals the scale of the demand. This system only works if a community plans ahead, stores food, shares risk, and believes that short-term restraint is not the same thing as collective ruin. That is the hidden foundation beneath Jubilee. Before a society can imagine restoring land after generations of inequality, it has to practice release in smaller intervals. Before it can proclaim liberty in the 50th year, it has to learn every 7th year that neither debt nor harvest nor private control can be allowed to run without end. And once that principle enters the law, it leads to an even more unsettling question. If the land rests and debts are released, who really owns the land in the first place? The answer Leviticus gives is simple, and from a modern perspective almost shocking. Nobody owns it absolutely. You shall not sell the land in perpetuity, the text says, for the land is mine. The people are described not as ultimate owners, but as strangers and sojourners living on God's land. That one sentence changes the entire economic logic of Jubilee. In most societies, land is the foundation of permanent wealth. Control enough fertile ground and you control food. Control food and you can survive bad years better than your neighbours. You can lend grain when they are desperate, You can take repayment in silver, livestock, labour, or eventually land itself. Then your children inherit more than you started with, while their children inherit less. Over enough generations, a few families become land-rich and politically powerful, while everyone else becomes dependent. That pattern is ancient. It is also familiar. But the Jubilee laws imagine a barrier placed directly in its path. Land could be worked, inherited, improved, and transferred. Families had real claims to their fields, vineyards, pasture land, and homes. This was not a world with no property, but the ultimate title, the deepest claim beneath every human claim, belonged to God. And if God was the true owner, then no human buyer could turn another family's ancestral inheritance into permanent private conquest. Picture an Israelite village in the idealized world behind Leviticus. Generations earlier, the land had been divided among tribes and clans. Each household had an allotment, not necessarily equal in every detail, but connected to a family line. Your field was not just an investment. It was the place your parents had worked, the place your grandparents had planted, the place where your children were expected to survive after you were gone. To lose that land was not like selling an old tool or a piece of furniture. It meant losing your economic base. Your family's future was suddenly hanging from someone else's decisions. And in an agricultural society, that could happen fast. A drought comes, the barley fails, a child gets sick. Animals die. Raiders take part of the harvest. Taxes or tribute are due anyway. So the family borrows. Maybe first from relatives, then from a wealthier neighbour, then they sell part of the expected harvest, then part of the field itself. This is where Jubilee steps in. Leviticus does not describe a normal land sale in the way modern real estate law would. It treats the transaction more like a lease. The buyer is not purchasing the land forever. The buyer is purchasing the number of harvests remaining until the Jubilee year. If Jubilee is far away, the price is higher because there are more crops still to come. If Jubilee is near, the price is lower because the buyer has fewer years to benefit from the field. The value is calculated according to produce, not according to permanent possession. That is a remarkably precise idea. You are not buying the earth beneath someone else's feet. You are buying temporary access to its yield. When the 50th year arrives, the land returns to the original family line. A household that had been forced by hunger, debt, or disaster to sell its field could recover the inheritance that made independent life possible. Not automatically all wealth, not every animal, not every lost possession, but the foundation, the place from which a family could begin again. And there was another protection built into the system. If a relative gained the resources to help, that relative could act as a redeemer. The land could be bought back before Jubilee, with the price adjusted for the number of harvest years remaining. The seller could also redeem it personally if circumstances improved. So the law creates multiple escape routes from permanent dispossession. A bad year does not have to become a bad bloodline. That is the social heart of Jubilee. Poverty is treated as real. Crop failure is real. Debt is real. The law does not pretend every family will make equally wise decisions or enjoy equal luck. Some people will face disasters they did not cause. Others may make choices they regret. But the system refuses to let temporary vulnerability become irreversible inheritance. This is the point where Jubilee becomes much more than a religious calendar rule. It is a direct challenge to the way wealth normally reproduces itself. Without some kind of restraint, land tends to concentrate. A family with reserves can survive the bad harvest. A family without reserves borrows. The wealthy buyer acquires more acreage at exactly the moment the poor seller has the least bargaining power. Then another crisis comes and the process repeats. Eventually, the village may still contain the same number of people, but it no longer contains the same number of independent households. Some own, others work, some lend, others owe, some pass security to their children, others pass down dependency. Jubilee imagines interrupting that machinery before it can run forever. Not every 50 years, because 50 is magically economic. Not because ancient Israelites had discovered some mathematical law of history. The number comes from the sacred rhythm of 7 sevens completed by the 50th year. But the social effect is clear. No family should be able to turn another family's misfortune into an eternal claim on its future. That does not mean the system abolishes inequality. Leviticus does not create a modern program of equal income. A diligent farmer could still prosper. A family with more workers, better soil, stronger animals, or successful trade connections could do better than its neighbours. People could accumulate movable wealth. They could own houses in certain settings. They could employ labour. The biblical world was not a classless utopia. But it placed a limit on one especially dangerous form of inequality: permanent control of the land that everyone else needed to live. Even the rules for houses reveal how carefully the system distinguishes between kinds of property. A house in a walled city could be sold permanently if it was not redeemed within a year. But houses in villages without walls were treated more like fields. They returned in Jubilee. Why? Probably because rural homes were tied directly to agricultural survival. They belonged to the inherited productive landscape. Urban property, by contrast, could be treated differently. Then there are the Levites, who receive special protections for their towns and pasture lands. Again the principle appears: certain forms of land cannot simply disappear into the hands of buyers, because the community depends on them remaining connected to those assigned to them. Now compare that with the modern assumption many of us barely notice. In a modern market economy, private property is often imagined as nearly absolute. If you legally buy land, pay for it, improve it, and pass it to your children, then it is yours. You can sell it, lease it, mortgage it, develop it, hold it vacant, or keep it for speculation. If someone else cannot afford land, that may be tragic. But the market is usually treated as the final referee. Jubilee asks a question that sounds almost alien inside that framework. What if a legal purchase is not the same thing as a moral right to permanent control? What if land is not merely a commodity, because nobody created it? You can build a house, you can plant an orchard, you can dig a well, build a road, add labour, skill and risk. But you did not make the soil, you did not invent rain. You did not create the seasons, the rivers, the minerals, or the basic fact that every human being needs access to a place to live. Leviticus turns that observation into law. The land is God's. Human beings are tenants, stewards, and temporary holders. Their rights matter, but those rights exist inside a larger obligation to kin, community, future generations, and divine ownership. Of course, this raises a difficult historical question. Did ancient Israel actually operate this way? Did fields truly return every 50th year across the whole land? Or was Jubilee an ideal, a legal vision so demanding that it was rarely, if ever, fully enacted? The text gives us the blueprint. History gives us a much messier story. The messiest part of that story is what happened when a family had already lost more than its field, because land was not the only thing a desperate person could sell. In the ancient world, debt could pull people downward in stages. First, a household borrowed grain, seed, silver or animals. Then it pledged future harvests, then it sold land rights. And if the crisis continued, the people themselves could become the last asset left. That does not mean every form of ancient servitude was identical. The modern word slavery can hide important differences. Ancient societies had prisoners of war, people bought through trade, household slaves, foreign captives, permanent slaves, temporary debt servants, and poor workers who had technically entered service voluntarily because the alternative was starvation. Their actual lives could vary enormously depending on the household, the law, the region, and the character of the master. But the basic reality was brutal enough. A person without land, reserves, or powerful relatives could lose control over his labour, his household, and his future. The biblical laws address that danger directly, especially when the person in trouble is an Israelite. Leviticus imagines a man becoming poor beside you. Maybe the harvest fails. Maybe debt accumulates. Maybe he cannot support his family. Eventually, he sells himself to a wealthier Israelite household. That phrase sounds shocking, because it is shocking. Poverty had become so severe that his labour, and often his freedom of movement, had become the price of survival. But Leviticus insists that this person must not be treated as an ordinary slave. He shall serve with you as a hired worker, as a sojourner, the law says. In other words, he is not supposed to be reduced to a thing. He is a poor member of the community who has entered a dependent condition. He works, he owes service, but he remains a person with a claim to eventual release. And at Jubilee, he goes free. Not just him, his children go with him. And if the system works as written, he returns to his clan and to his ancestral property. The release is not merely permission to walk away with nothing. It is supposed to restore the social conditions of independence. That is the difference between freedom as a word and freedom as something you can actually live. You can tell a person they are free, but if they have no land, no tools, no kin support, no food, no access to work, and debts waiting at the gate, that freedom may be painfully thin. Jubilee tries to make liberty material. It connects release from service with return to inheritance. A person is not fully restored until they have a place in the economic life of the community again. The key word in Leviticus 25 is often translated liberty. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. The Hebrew word is diror. Its exact origins are debated. Some scholars connect it with the idea of free movement, like a bird released to fly. Others see it as a technical legal term for emancipation or release from obligation. Whatever its deeper linguistic history, its meaning in the Jubilee passage is clear enough. Dera is not vague spiritual comfort. It is a public declaration that people held in dependency are to be released. The phrase became famous far beyond ancient Israel. It is engraved on the Liberty Bell in the United States. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. But in Leviticus, liberty is not primarily about national independence, free speech, or elections. Those are modern political associations. Biblical diror is tied to debt, land, labour, family, and return. It means that poverty must not become a permanent social identity. That is the moral engine beneath the law. A person may fall. A family may lose its footing. The text does not deny failure, scarcity, or debt. It assumes all of them, but it rejects the idea that one season of hunger should condemn descendants generations later. Think about how easily that can happen. A farmer borrows after a drought. He cannot repay. He loses land. Without land, he has less income next year. So he borrows again. His children grow up working for the creditor's household instead of learning to manage their own field. The creditor's children inherit more land, more labour, and more security. The debtor's children inherit dependence. Eventually, nobody remembers the first drought. They only see one family as naturally rich and another as naturally poor. Jubilee is designed to interrupt that forgetting. But it is important not to turn these ancient laws into a modern financial system before we understand what they were. Biblical debt release is not the same as consumer bankruptcy. Ancient Israelites did not have credit cards, student loans, mortgage-backed securities, credit scores, or multinational banks. Their debts were often embedded in a local agricultural economy. A bad harvest could mean immediate hunger. A loan might be grain needed to survive until the next season. Repayment could involve crops, land use, or years of labour. Modern bankruptcy law usually asks a different set of questions. What assets does the debtor have? Which creditors have priority? Can loans be restructured? What income can be protected? What obligations survive discharge? It operates inside a complex economy built on contracts, institutions and credit markets that Leviticus never knew. So Jubilee is not a ready-made policy manual for cancelling every modern debt every 50 years. But it does raise a question modern systems still struggle to answer. When does debt stop being a tool for exchange and become a machine for trapping people? The biblical answer is severe. Lending to the poor must not become an opportunity for extraction. Leviticus prohibits charging interest to a poor Israelite in need. It tells the lender to sustain the person, that your brother may live beside you. That language matters. The goal is not simply repayment. The goal is that the vulnerable person remains alive, present, and able to belong. Other biblical laws create related, but not identical, release rhythms. Exodus and Deuteronomy speak of Hebrew servants serving for 6 years and being released in the 7th. Deuteronomy also describes a 7th-year release of debts, though scholars debate exactly how broadly that rule was applied. Did it cancel all debts permanently? Suspend collection during the Sabbatical year? Apply mainly to certain personal loans among Israelites? The text has been argued over for centuries. Leviticus adds another layer. Its Jubilee release comes after 7 cycles of 7 years. It is larger, more dramatic, and tied not only to labour but to the return of ancestral land. And there is another difficult limit we cannot ignore. The laws do not treat everyone equally. Leviticus makes a sharp distinction between Israelite debt servants and foreign slaves. Israelites are not to be ruled ruthlessly and are released in Jubilee. Foreigners could be acquired as slaves and passed on as property. From a modern moral perspective, that distinction is impossible to soften. Jubilee contains a powerful vision of release, but it exists inside an ancient society that still accepted slavery. That tension matters because it stops us from romanticizing the text. Jubilee was not a complete abolition of hierarchy. It did not erase patriarchy, class differences, forced labour, or ethnic boundaries. It protected a particular covenant community from permanent internal dispossession. That was radical in one sense, but limited in another. And historians still ask the question, left hanging at the end of the last section, were these rules actually practiced? The honest answer is that the evidence is thin. We have the laws, we have later references to sabbatical years. We have prophetic complaints about debt, exploitation, and enslaving fellow Israelites. We have stories showing that wealthy people could ignore the ideals. But we do not have a clear archive showing every field across ancient Israel returning to its original clan on schedule every 50th year. Some scholars think Jubilee was an ambitious legal ideal, perhaps rarely implemented across an entire kingdom. Others think parts of it may have operated locally, selectively, or in altered forms. Still, others see it as a theological critique of economic reality, a vision written precisely because permanent inequality and debt bondage were becoming too common. But even if the blueprint was never fully built, the blueprint still tells us what its authors feared. They feared a world where misfortune became inheritance. They feared creditors becoming masters, neighbours becoming property, and poverty hardening into destiny. And they imagined that liberty meant more than opening a prison door. It meant giving people a way back, So did ancient Israel ever actually observe Jubilee? Not in the full sweeping form Leviticus describes, not in any way we can confidently document. That answer may sound disappointing. A law this dramatic seems like it should leave dramatic evidence behind. You might expect royal decrees, land registers, court records, contracts rewritten in the 50th year, maybe inscriptions announcing that fields had returned to their ancestral families. We do not have that archive. Ancient Israel left us no surviving document that says, this year, across the entire kingdom, every Israelite debt servant was released, every leased field reverted to its clan, and every household observed the Jubilee fallow. That does not prove it never happened. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Especially in a world where papyrus decays, villages disappear, and most ordinary transactions were never carved into stone. But it does mean historians have to be careful. Jubilee is clearly prescribed in the biblical law. That is one kind of evidence. Actual records showing it was carried out nationwide are another. And those are not the same thing. Think about the difference between a constitution, a campaign promise, and a government report. A constitution tells you what a society claims should happen. A campaign promise tells you what leaders say they want to do. A government report, tax ledger, court case, or contract can sometimes tell you what happened on the ground. Leviticus gives us the prescription. It gives us the ideal. But ancient Israel's documentary record gives us only fragments of practice. And some of those fragments suggest that the ideal was under enormous pressure. One of the clearest examples comes from the book of Jeremiah, during one of the darkest moments in Judah's history. Jerusalem is under Babylonian siege. The city is trapped. Food is scarce. Fear is everywhere. And in that crisis, King Zedekiah makes a covenant with the people to proclaim release. Hebrew slaves are to be freed. For a moment, it looks like a return to the old social law. The wealthy release men and women who had been held in service. But then, according to Jeremiah 34, they reverse themselves. They bring the freed people back and force them into bondage again. Whether this was a formal Jubilee observance, a seventh-year release, an emergency reform, or some mixture of all three is debated. The text does not give us a calendar date and say, this was the 50th year, but it preserves something historically important. Release was not just an abstract idea buried in an old law code. It was a live moral and legal issue. People knew the command. And at least some people were willing to ignore it when it cost them labour. That may be the most realistic picture of ancient reform. Not a perfect system running automatically every 50 years, but a contested principle. A rule remembered, invoked, violated, restored briefly under pressure, and violated again. The book of Nehemiah gives us another glimpse of that struggle centuries later after the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem is being rebuilt. The people are poor. Some have mortgaged fields, vineyards, and homes during famine. Others have borrowed money to pay royal taxes. Their children are being driven into debt servitude. The scene sounds painfully familiar. A bad season becomes a loan. The loan becomes a pledge. The pledge becomes loss of land. The loss of land becomes loss of children's freedom. Nehemiah confronts the wealthy elite. He demands that they return fields, vineyards, olive orchards, houses, and the interest they have taken. The nobles agree, at least in the story, to restore what they had seized. Again, this is not a documented nationwide jubilee. It does not prove that the 50-year cycle was operating exactly as Leviticus envisioned. But it shows that the Jubilee world of thoughtland restoration, debt relief, liberation from dependency could still shape reform language long after the original laws were written. The principle had survived because the problem had survived. And then there are the warning texts. Leviticus itself warns that if Israel refuses to obey God's commands, including the sabbatical rest of the land, the people will be removed from the land. Then the text says, "The land will finally enjoy its missed Sabbaths while it lies desolate." Later biblical writers connect that warning to the exile. 2 Chronicles explains the Babylonian exile in exactly those terms. Judah is taken away, and the land rests to fulfill 70 years until it has enjoyed the Sabbaths that had been neglected. The number may carry symbolic meaning, especially because it echoes Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. Historians should not treat it as a simple agricultural spreadsheet showing exactly how many sabbatical years were missed. But the theological claim is unmistakable. Israel did not merely break rules about worship. It broke rules about land, labour, debt, and limits. The land was supposed to rest. The poor were supposed to be protected. Wealth was not supposed to harden permanently in one set of hands. When those boundaries were ignored, the writers of these texts saw exile itself as the consequence. That is a powerful interpretation of national disaster. Babylon did not conquer Judah merely because Babylon was stronger. In this moral reading, Judah had already destroyed the covenantal order that made its life in the land legitimate. Still, we need to keep our categories clear. Legal prescription is what the law commands. Religious aspiration is what a community believes ought to be true, even when it falls short. Documented practice is what surviving evidence can show people actually did. For Jubilee, the first category is strong. The law in Leviticus is detailed, memorable, and economically serious. The second is strong too. Prophets, reform narratives, and later biblical writers repeatedly return to release, restoration, and the danger of exploitation. The third is limited. We cannot confidently reconstruct a kingdom-wide Jubilee system operating on schedule for centuries. We cannot say every family received its ancestral land back every 50th year. We cannot say every creditor obeyed the release laws. The stories we do have often suggest the opposite. Laws of release were needed because release was being resisted. But that does not make Jubilee meaningless. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. A society does not usually write elaborate protections against dangers it cannot imagine. Jubilee tells us that ancient Israel knew how quickly debt could become domination. It knew that land could concentrate. It knew that freedom could disappear quietly, one contract at a time. Maybe the full reset was rarely achieved. Maybe it was never achieved across the whole nation. But the demand remained in the text, waiting to accuse every generation that allowed poverty to become permanent. And that accusation would become one of the great languages of the prophets. The prophets took that accusation and made it impossible to ignore. They did not usually sit down and explain Jubilee like lawyers working through a statute book. They did something more dangerous. They took the old language of release, return, rest, inheritance, and freedom, and turned it into a moral test for the entire nation. You say you belong to God. Then, what happens to the poor when the harvest fails? You say this is God's land? Then why are powerful families swallowing field after field? You say you keep the festivals then? Why are people being sold, trapped, beaten, and pushed out of their inheritance? That is the prophetic move. The law becomes an indictment. Isaiah is one of the clearest examples. In Isaiah 61, a speaker announces that God has sent him to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and release to prisoners. Then comes the phrase that would echo through centuries of Jewish and Christian interpretation, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. That language sounds like Jubilee for a reason. The Hebrew word often translated liberty is diror, the same rare word used in Leviticus for the Jubilee proclamation. It does not just mean feeling free inside your mind. It means release, a public declaration that people who have been trapped can go free. And notice how Isaiah expands the idea. In Leviticus, Jubilee is rooted in land, labour, debt, and family inheritance. It is concrete. Fields lie fallow, property returns. Debt servants go free. In Isaiah, those concrete images become larger. Release now reaches captives, mourners, ruined cities, and a people whose whole world has been broken apart. Ancient ruins will be rebuilt, devastated places will be restored. Those who have been shamed will receive honour. This is not necessarily a claim that a literal 50th year has arrived on the calendar. Scholars debate exactly how closely Isaiah 61 depends on the Jubilee law, and whether the year of the Lord's favour refers to a specific legal cycle. But the connection is hard to miss. Jubilee language had become a language for national restoration, and that makes sense in the world Isaiah's followers were trying to survive. If a family loses a field, Jubilee imagines return. But what if the entire people lose the land? What if Jerusalem is destroyed, its leaders carried away, its fields occupied by foreign powers, its survivors scattered across an empire? Then release has to mean more than one household getting property back. It has to mean coming home. Other prophetic passages push the same logic in a harsher direction. Isaiah 58 attacks people who fast and pray while exploiting their workers, fighting among themselves, and ignoring the hungry. The fast God chooses, the prophet says, is to loosen the bonds of wickedness, undo heavy burdens, let the oppressed go free, and break every yoke. Again, freedom is not presented as a private spiritual metaphor. It is social, economic, physical. Feed the hungry. House the homeless, cover the naked. Stop using power to crush people. That is what covenant faithfulness looks like. Jeremiah makes the stakes even more brutal. During Babylon's siege of Jerusalem, King Zedekiah and the people make a covenant to release enslaved Hebrews. Then they take them back. The text is almost shocking in its simplicity. They free people, then they reclaim them. Imagine being told you are no longer property. Imagine walking away from the household that owns your labour, maybe returning to your relatives, maybe believing, for one brief moment, that the old command still means something. Then the masters change their minds. Jeremiah says, this reversal profaned God's name. The people had publicly declared release, then turned release into another broken promise. And the prophet answers with a terrible wordplay. Because they refused to proclaim liberty to their brothers and sisters, God would proclaim liberty to them, liberty for the sword, for plague, and for famine. Not freedom from disaster, freedom into disaster. That is the prophet's logic of collapse. Judah's destruction is not explained only by Babylonian military strength, though Babylon was absolutely stronger. It is interpreted as the result of a society that had violated the obligations holding it together. The poor were not protected. The enslaved were not released. The land's moral limits were ignored. The covenant became ceremony without justice. Ezekiel develops this critique from another angle. Writing around the catastrophe of exile, he describes Jerusalem as a city of bloodshed, bribery, exploitation, and extortion. Princes seize by force. Officials take unjust gain. The strong prey on the weak. In Ezekiel 22, the prophet says the people have wronged the resident alien, oppressed the orphan and widow, and committed robbery against the poor and needy. This is not a random list of bad behaviour. It is a map of social breakdown. The powerful have forgotten that power has limits. Later, Ezekiel imagines a restored land and a restored temple. But even there, the economic problem has not vanished. In Ezekiel 45 and 46, rulers are warned not to dispossess the people of their property. A prince may give land from his own holdings, but he must not take inheritance away from ordinary Israelites. and property given to a servant returns at a designated time. The details are not identical to Leviticus. Ezekiel's system has its own structure, and scholars debate how literally it was ever put into practice. But the principle is familiar. No ruler gets to turn public authority into permanent theft. No elite gets to consume the inheritance of everyone else. Amos and Micah had said much the same thing generations earlier. Amos condemns those who sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Micah attacks those who covet fields and seize them, who take houses from families and inheritance from children. These prophets understood something painfully modern. Exploitation rarely announces itself as exploitation. It arrives as a loan, a tax, a foreclosure, a rigged measure in the market, a field purchased from someone with no other choice, a labour arrangement that becomes impossible to escape. One transaction at a time, a society can create a permanent class of people with no land, no leverage, no security, and no way back. Jubilee stood against that future. The prophets made sure nobody could pretend the issue was merely technical. And after exile, this language grew even larger. Release came to mean return from captivity. Restoration came to mean the rebuilding of a people. The year of favour came to suggest that God had not forgotten the crushed, the indebted, the displaced, or the dead hopes of Israel. That is why later readers would hear Isaiah's proclamation and ask a dangerous question. What if the true Jubilee was still ahead? What if one day a chosen servant, a king, a priest, or a Messiah would finally announce the release the law had promised, but history had never fully delivered? But before anyone could ask when the true Jubilee might arrive, they faced a more immediate problem. How do you keep a sacred cycle when your entire world has been torn apart? The Babylonian conquest did not just destroy a city. It complicated every institution built around the land. The temple was burned. Jerusalem's walls were broken. The Davidic monarchy was finished, at least as a functioning political reality. Many leading families, priests, scribes, artisans, and officials were carried into Babylon. Others remained in a devastated countryside, now controlled by an imperial power. And the land itself, the centre of the Torah's agricultural laws, was no longer securely in Israelite hands. That matters because Sabbath years and Jubilee were not abstract ideas. They depended on fields, harvests, family boundaries, debts, labour and inheritance. They assumed a people living on ancestral land, counting years together, and possessing enough authority to let the land rest and release people from obligations. Exile shattered that framework. If your family had been forced from its farm, what did return mean? If another population had settled the region, who had the right to reclaim a field? If land had changed hands during war, confiscation, famine, and migration, could an ancient inheritance system simply be switched back on? And then there was the question nobody could answer by looking at the sky. Where were they in the cycle? Had the seventh-year rhythm continued while people were in exile? Did it pause when the community was displaced? If the count began when Israel first entered the land, did losing the land reset everything? And if Jubilee depended on 7 cycles of 7 years, how could anyone prove the count had remained uninterrupted through conquest, deportation, return, and political chaos? These were not minor calendar questions. They were questions about whether sacred order could survive historical disaster. The Bible itself offers one powerful answer through the tradition of 70 years. Jeremiah had warned that Judah and the surrounding nations would serve Babylon for 70 years. Later biblical writers connected that number to the land's missed rests. 2 Chronicles says the land enjoyed its Sabbaths during the period of desolation, to fulfill 70 years. The idea reaches back to Leviticus 26. There, if Israel refuses God's commands, exile becomes the ultimate consequence. The people are scattered among the nations, and the land is left empty. Then the text says, the land will enjoy its Sabbaths. Think about the force of that image. The people would not let the land rest voluntarily. So exile would force the rest upon them. For generations, perhaps, fields had been planted and harvested, without regard for the sacred rhythm. Wealth accumulated. Debts deepened, the powerful expanded their holdings. The laws of release remained ideals, warnings, maybe memories. Then came conquest, and suddenly the land lay empty. Whether the 70 years should be read as an exact chronological total is debated. Babylonian domination of Judah, Jerusalem's destruction, the first return under Persian rule, and the rebuilding of the temple all happened across several overlapping dates. Depending on where someone begins and ends the count, the numbers change. But that may be exactly the point. The number 70 was not functioning only like an entry in an imperial tax ledger. It was an interpretation of catastrophe. 7 is the number of Sabbath completion. 70 is 7 multiplied outward, a full measure of sacred rest. The exile was being read not simply as a military defeat, but as a reckoning built into time itself. History had violated the rhythm. History would be judged by the rhythm. Then Babylon fell. In 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon. Not long after, exiled communities were permitted to return and rebuild. For some Judeans, that return must have felt like a direct answer to the prophetic language they had preserved for decades. Captivity had not been the end. There were journeys back to Judah. There was a rebuilt altar. Eventually, there was a rebuilt temple, completed in the late 6th century BCE. Jerusalem's walls would be rebuilt later, under Persian authorization. A community that had nearly lost its political independence began rebuilding something more durable than a kingdom, identity, and that rebuilding happened through law, worship, memory, and time. The post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah show a community intensely concerned with boundaries. Who belongs to Israel? Which marriages, lineages, priestly families, and obligations count? How should Sabbath be observed? How should offerings be supplied? When should the festivals be kept? How can a people scattered by empire become a people again? Nehemiah describes public readings of the Torah, communal confession, covenant renewal, concern for the Sabbath, and efforts to prevent commerce from swallowing the sacred day. It also describes people pledging to bring offerings, support the temple, and observe the 7th-year release of debts. That last detail is crucial. The sabbatical principle had not disappeared into the ruins. It was being reclaimed as part of a restored covenant life. But reclaiming a command and proving an exact cycle are very different things. A community can say, "We will keep the Sabbath year." It is much harder to say, "This is definitely year 42 since the last Jubilee, and we can demonstrate every count without a gap." Ancient sources do preserve later discussions of sabbatical years. Jewish tradition developed methods for identifying them, and later rabbinic writings preserve memories, calculations, and disagreements. But the evidence does not give modern historians a single, universally secure chain of Jubilee, dates running continuously from ancient Israel onward. There are too many breaks, wars, deportations, foreign rule, conflicting systems of regnal years, different ways of counting a year's beginning, uncertainty over whether Jubilee was the 49th year, the 50th year, or functioned alongside the 7th-year cycle in another way, and above all, uncertainty over how ancient communities handled interrupted counts after exile. This is where chronology becomes something more than neutral record-keeping. To modern eyes, a calendar looks like a tool. It tells you when to plant, when to pay taxes, when winter ends, when a meeting begins. But in the post-exilic world, sacred time could tell a people who they were. If the festivals were kept at the right times, the community was not merely remembering old stories. It was stepping back into the story. Passover said, "We were delivered." The Day of Atonement said, "We can be cleansed." Sabbath said, "Our labour is not absolute." The Sabbatical year said, "Neither debt nor possession should own us forever." And Jubilee, whether fully practised, remembered, reimagined, or hoped for, said something even larger. Exile does not get the final word. Loss does not get the final word. The land, the people, and time itself can be restored to their proper order. That is why later Jewish communities became so deeply invested in calendars, genealogies, priestly schedules, and chronological schemes. They were not obsessing over dates for no reason. They were searching for evidence that history still had a pattern. God's promises had not dissolved into the chaos of empire. But we need to be careful here. Scriptural interpretation can tell us how ancient writers understood exile and return. It can show us why 70 years became meaningful, why missed Sabbaths became a moral explanation for disaster, and why sacred cycles became central to rebuilding identity. It cannot always give us a verifiable modern calendar reconstruction. Those are different claims. One belongs to theology, memory, and interpretation. The other belongs to historical chronology, where evidence is fragmentary and certainty is often impossible. And after exile, that tension only grew stronger, because once a people begins searching the past for the hidden order of sacred time, the next question becomes unavoidable. What if heaven itself keeps the calendar? What if heaven itself keeps the calendar? That question takes us into one of the most fascinating collections of Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, a world of scribes, priests, rival calendars, angelic liturgies, and people trying to discover the exact pattern hidden beneath ordinary time. At the centre of that world is a work known as the Book of Jubilees. It is not part of the Hebrew Bible, but it was clearly important to some ancient Jewish communities. Copies of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran, alongside biblical manuscripts, legal texts, prayers, visions, and detailed calendrical writings. That alone tells us something. For the people who preserved these texts, Jubilees was not a strange little side story. It was part of a serious attempt to understand how history, worship, law, and the cosmos all fit together. The book retells much of Genesis and the early part of Exodus. You hear familiar names: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses. But the story is arranged differently. In Jubilees, history is measured, divided, and locked into a sacred mathematical structure. Years are not just years. 7 years make a week of years. 7 of those weeks make a Jubilee. In this system, a Jubilee is 49 years, 7 times 7. Major events in the lives of the patriarchs are dated according to these units. Abraham is born in a particular Jubilee. Noah's life unfolds through carefully counted years and weeks. Israel's story is not drifting through an undefined ancient past. It is moving through a timetable. Think about what that does to history. Instead of a vast wilderness of dates, accidents, and forgotten generations, the past becomes an ordered architecture. Every life has a location. Every covenant has a place in the pattern. Every generation falls somewhere inside a sequence that heaven has already measured. The Book of Jubilees presents this knowledge as revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai. In the story, angels are deeply involved. Moses does not simply receive a few commandments and then work out the details later. Heavenly beings are associated with the transmission and preservation of sacred knowledge. The law, the festivals, the chronology, even the proper shape of time itself, are connected to what the book calls heavenly tablets. That phrase is enormous. Heavenly tablets mean the true order of reality is already written. Human beings do not invent sacred time. They discover it, obey it, or corrupt it. And that is where the calendar becomes a battlefield. Jubilees strongly favours a 364-day year. That number may sound oddly specific, but it creates a beautifully symmetrical system. 364 divides evenly into 52 weeks. 52 weeks means every festival can fall on the same day of the week every year. No shifting, no uncertainty, no wondering whether a feast has wandered into the wrong season because someone observed the new moon differently. For a community obsessed with order, that regularity was not just convenient. It was evidence of divine design. A 364-day calendar made time look like a temple, balanced, measured, predictable. Every course of priests, every Sabbath, every appointed festival could be placed in its proper slot. Worship on earth could mirror order in heaven, but there was a practical problem. The actual solar year is about 365.25 days long, so a calendar of exactly 364 days needs some method of correction if it is going to remain aligned with the seasons over long periods. Ancient texts preserve the ideal 364-day structure, but scholars still debate exactly how communities using it handled that discrepancy in practice. Some form of adjustment may have existed, or the calendar may sometimes have functioned more as a sacred scheme than as a fully recoverable civil system. Either way, the argument was real. Other Jewish groups followed lunar or lunisolar calendars, in which months were tied more directly to the moon's changing phases. Those systems also required adjustment, because lunar months do not line up neatly with the solar year. But for the writers behind Jubilees, the danger was not merely technical. A wrong calendar could mean a wrong festival, and a wrong festival could mean offering worship on the wrong day. Imagine the accusation. You believe you're celebrating Passover. You believe you are keeping the Day of Atonement. You believe your priests are serving according to God's command. But if your calendar is wrong, then your worship is out of sync with heaven itself. That is why calendar disagreements in the Second Temple period could become so intense. They were arguments about authority. Who has the right to determine sacred time? The temple establishment in Jerusalem, priestly families, scriptural interpreters, a separated wilderness community, the moon visible in the sky, or a perfect calendar revealed by angels. The scrolls associated with Qumran show just how far this concern could go. Alongside copies of Jubilees, there are calendrical texts, lists of priestly courses, festival schedules, and writings that imagine angelic worship taking place in a perfect heavenly order. The people connected with these manuscripts are often called the Qumran community, though exactly who they were and how they related to groups such as the Essenes remains debated. What is not debated is their intense concern with correct observance. They cared about purity. They cared about priesthood. They cared about separation from what they saw as corruption. And they cared deeply about time. In some of their writings, priests on earth are not acting alone. They are joining a cosmic liturgy already being performed by angels. The temple is not just a building in Jerusalem, it has a heavenly counterpart. The calendar is not just a tool for tracking harvests. It is part of the structure linking earthly worship to the movements of the divine world, and Jubilee fits perfectly into that vision. In Leviticus, Jubilee had been tied to land, debt, liberty, inheritance, and the prevention of permanent loss. It was a social and agricultural reset built into the life of Israel. But in Jubilees, the idea expands. Jubilee becomes a way of mapping all of history. The cycles no longer only tell farmers when land should rest. They tell readers where Adam belongs, where Noah belongs, where Abraham belongs, where Moses belongs. Sacred time reaches backward before Israel even exists as a nation. The whole story of humanity becomes measurable through recurring blocks of 7 and 7 times 7. This does not prove that every ancient Jew used one universal Jubilee calendar. It does not give modern historians an unbroken, verifiable count from creation to the present. And it certainly does not demonstrate that world events mechanically reset every 49 or 50 years. What it reveals is something different, and maybe more important. It reveals a community that refused to see history as random. For them, time had a blueprint. The angels knew it. The heavens preserved it. The righteous were expected to live by it. And when human institutions failed, when priests became corrupt, when empires ruled the land, when calendars conflicted and sacred days seemed uncertain, the answer was not to abandon the pattern. It was to search for the original one. But once you start reading history in Jubilee-sized blocks, a much bigger possibility appears. What if those cycles were not only for worship? What if they could be used to read the rise and fall of history itself? And that is the middle claim, the claim that sits between ancient law and modern speculation. Maybe history itself moves in Jubilee-sized waves, not in the simple sense that every 50th year brings a miracle, a collapse, or a divine announcement from the sky. Nobody can open a spreadsheet, count 50 boxes, and predict the future with that kind of precision. But once the idea gets into your head, it becomes hard not to look. You begin noticing that 50 years is long enough for almost everything to change. A child born at the beginning of a 50-year period can become a grandparent by the end of it. A war can redraw borders. A revolutionary movement can become a government. A new technology can go from laboratory experiment to something sitting in every home. Fortunes can be made, inherited, concentrated, destroyed, and made again. 50 years is not just a number, it is close to the span in which a society can forget what the last crisis felt like. The people who remember a depression firsthand begin leaving public life. The generation shaped by a war grows old. The rules created after a financial panic start looking outdated, restrictive, maybe even unnecessary. Then a new generation tests the limits. Debt expands. Institutions weaken. Old agreements come under pressure. And suddenly the past, which seemed safely buried, comes back in a new form. This is why people search for patterns. Human history is overwhelming. Thousands of years, millions of lives, empires rising, fragmenting, merging, disappearing. Dates pile up until the past can feel like a warehouse with no map. So the mind searches for structure. We look for recurring intervals because intervals turn chaos into something we can hold. 7 years, 40 years, 100 years, and because of Jubilee, 50 years. Pattern researchers have tried to place major events into these blocks. They line up wars, crashes, elections, revolutions, debt crises, reform movements, and generational shifts. They ask whether periods of expansion tend to be followed by periods of correction, whether a society's founding ideals get renewed, abandoned, or violently reinterpreted after roughly 2 generations, whether financial systems repeatedly build toward unsustainable levels of speculation before some kind of reset becomes unavoidable. And sometimes the results can look almost eerie. Start with a major war, then move forward 50 years, and you may find another geopolitical rupture. Start with a banking panic, move forward several decades, and you may find a different kind of financial crisis. Start with a civil rights breakthrough, an industrial transformation, or a major constitutional settlement, and later generations may be fighting over the same unresolved question in a new language. The pattern can seem to be everywhere, but here is where we have to slow down. Because a pattern is not the same thing as proof. The biggest problem is called choosing the starting point after you have already seen the result. If you begin with a date that makes the next event land neatly 50 years later, you can create a very convincing story. But history gives you a nearly unlimited supply of possible starting dates. Was the cycle supposed to begin with the first battle of a war, the peace treaty, the revolution, the new constitution, the market crash, the recovery, the law passed in response? Change the starting point by 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years, and a different set of matches may suddenly appear. That flexibility is dangerous. If a theory can explain every outcome after the fact, it may not be predicting anything at all. And the events themselves can be stretched. A war might mean a declaration, an invasion, a long cold conflict, or a regional struggle. A crash might mean a stock market plunge, a banking failure, a recession, or an entire decade of hardship. A reform might mean a speech, a protest, a court ruling, or a law that takes years to enforce. The broader the categories become, the easier it is to find recurrence. Imagine throwing a handful of darts at a huge wall, then drawing circles around the places where two landed close together. You could call it a pattern, but the circles came after the darts. History can work the same way, and selective memory makes it even stronger. We remember the intervals that line up beautifully. We forget the ones that do not. We remember the dramatic crises. We ignore the 50-year gaps filled with slow change, local events, and no obvious turning point at all. If you want more deep dives into mysteries where evidence, history, and interpretation collide, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, none of this means recurrence is meaningless. Human societies really do have rhythms. Generations replace one another. Institutions age. Debts accumulate. Land changes hands. Technologies disrupt old arrangements, the memories of catastrophe fade, and the conditions that produced catastrophe can slowly return. Those are not supernatural claims, they are ordinary consequences of human behaviour unfolding over time. A 50-year interval may sometimes capture those processes because it is large enough for memory to fade, power to change hands, and a whole social order to mature. But that is very different from saying history obeys a hidden cosmic metronome. The ancient Jubilee offered Israel a deliberate reset. Land was to return. Debt servitude was to end. Inequality was not supposed to become permanent simply because one family had suffered one bad generation. The cycle was not necessarily predicting a collapse. It was trying to prevent one. That distinction matters. Maybe the most interesting question is not, does history automatically reset every 50 years? Maybe it is, what happens when societies fail to build resets into their own systems? When debt has no limit? When wealth becomes permanently detached from inheritance? When institutions cannot correct themselves? When a generation inherits problems it did not create and sees no mechanism for release? That is when Jubilee starts to feel less like an ancient curiosity and more like a warning. So hold the possibility open. Look at the dates. Notice the echoes. Ask whether certain pressures really do return across generations. But do not mistake our hunger for order, for evidence that the universe has handed us a timetable. Because before Israel imagined a sacred 50-year release, other societies had already discovered something important. Debt can become dangerous long before the 50th year arrives. Debt can become dangerous long before the 50th year arrives. And long before the biblical Jubilee, kings in Mesopotamia had already learned that lesson the hard way. Picture an ancient farming household in Sumer, Babylon, or Assyria. The harvest fails, maybe a canal breaks, maybe an invading army passes through and takes the grain stores. Maybe the taxes are due at exactly the moment the family has nothing left. So they borrow. At first, the loan may seem manageable. A few measures of barley, seed for the next planting. Silver to meet an obligation. But then the interest grows. Another bad season comes. The borrower pledges a field, a house, livestock, or the labour of a family member. Eventually, the debt is no longer just a number scratched into a clay tablet. It becomes a system of dependency. A farmer becomes tied to a creditor. A child enters debt bondage. Land that had supported one household for generations passes into the hands of somebody with more grain, more silver, and more power. That was not just a private tragedy, it was a political problem. A kingdom depended on free households. It needed farmers to work the land, pay taxes, provide labour, and serve in the army. If too many people lost their fields and fell into debt servitude, the state itself could weaken. Villages could empty. Social anger could build. Powerful creditors could accumulate influence that competed with the palace. So, at different times, Mesopotamian rulers announced what scholars often call clean slate proclamations. In Sumerian traditions, one important term was amagi, sometimes translated as return to the mother. In Akkadian-speaking kingdoms, rulers used terms such as misharim and andiorum. The words can carry ideas like justice, equity, freedom, release, or restoration. The details varied from kingdom to kingdom and from century to century. These were not always identical laws, but the basic move was recognizable. A king could proclaim a release. Certain debts were cancelled. Arrears owed to the palace might be forgiven. Some obligations to powerful officials or creditors could be wiped away. People who had entered debt bondage could be freed and returned to their homes. Property lost under conditions of distress could sometimes be restored. The point was not that every contract in the kingdom suddenly vanished. Commercial loans between merchants, especially loans connected to trade, often stood outside these measures. A businessman financing a caravan was not necessarily treated the same way as a struggling farmer borrowing grain to survive until harvest, and not every land transfer was automatically reversed. A legitimate sale, especially one involving major property or commercial investment, could be treated differently from a field surrendered under crushing pressure. But for ordinary households, the effect could be dramatic. A proclamation could interrupt the machinery of debt before it transformed temporary hardship into permanent class division. One of the clearest examples comes from the old Babylonian world. Kings such as Amisaduqa issued decrees addressing debt obligations, foreclosures, and people held because of debt. The famous law collection associated with Hammurabi also contains rules limiting debt servitude. A person could enter service because of debt, but the arrangement was not supposed to become endless. There were limits that matters, because it shows the biblical Jubilee was not appearing in a vacuum. Ancient Near Eastern societies were all wrestling with the same brutal question. What happens when a bad harvest, a tax burden, or a loan allows wealth to keep concentrating generation after generation? What happens when the people who produce the kingdom's food become dependent on the people who lend them seed? Different societies gave different answers, but the problem was shared. And the comparison with Leviticus is striking. The biblical laws of Sabbath years and Jubilee also worry about land, debt, poverty, servitude, and the restoration of households. They assume that economic disaster can trap a family for decades. They insist that an Israelite cannot be treated simply as disposable property. They place limits on the idea that land can be permanently absorbed by the wealthy. In both Mesopotamian release decrees and biblical law, we find a refusal to accept permanent ruin as normal. That is the connection, but the differences are just as important. A Mesopotamian clean slate was usually a royal act. The king announced it, he decided when it happened. Often it came near the beginning of a reign, after a crisis, or at a moment when a ruler needed to establish legitimacy. The message was powerful. The king had restored justice to the land. That sounds generous, but it also meant the reset depended on the palace. If the king did not proclaim release, there was no release. Jubilee, at least in the form described in Leviticus, imagines something different. It is not supposed to wait for a new ruler's generosity. It is built into sacred time, 7 cycles of 7 years, followed by the 50th year. The land rests, families return to ancestral holdings. Israelite debt servants go free. The logic is not, the king has chosen to be merciful. The logic is, the land belongs to God, and no human arrangement can claim ultimate ownership forever. That is a major shift. Mesopotamian rulers could use debt cancellation to strengthen royal authority. Biblical Jubilee, at least in theory, puts a limit on human authority itself. Kings, creditors, and wealthy families are all temporary. They may hold power for a season, but they cannot turn that season into permanent possession. So did Israel borrow Jubilee directly from Babylonian or earlier Mesopotamian law. We cannot say that with confidence. The evidence shows parallels. It shows shared regional concerns. It shows that debt release, restoration and protection from irreversible dependency were already part of the wider ancient Near Eastern conversation. Israel did not invent the human problem of debt bondage. But similarity is not proof of direct borrowing. Ideas can travel through trade, migration, war, administration, intermarriage, and storytelling. They can also emerge independently when neighbouring societies face the same pressures. Farmers losing land to creditors is not a uniquely Israelite problem. It is a recurring human problem. What makes Jubilee distinctive is the way it gathers those concerns into a sacred, recurring framework. Not a one-time royal rescue, not a public relations gesture from a newly crowned king. A built-in challenge to the permanent accumulation of power. And that ancient language of release would not disappear when Mesopotamian kings disappeared. It would travel, change shape, and eventually reappear in one of history's most powerful empires, Rome. Rome did not invent the language of release, but Rome helped carry it into a much larger world. By the 1st century, Jewish communities were spread across the Mediterranean. They lived in Judea, Galilee, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually the city of Rome itself. Many spoke Aramaic in daily life. Many also spoke Greek, the international language of trade, administration, philosophy, and scripture. And when Hebrew ideas entered Greek, they did not remain exactly the same. The Hebrew Bible had already been translated into Greek centuries earlier, in the collection known as the Septuagint. This was the Bible used by many Greek-speaking Jews and later by the first Christians. In that translation, one of the crucial words was aphesis. Aphesis can mean release, letting go, forgiveness, liberation from an obligation. It could be used for the cancellation of debt. It could describe the freeing of captives, and in religious language it came to mean forgiveness of sins. That is a remarkable expansion. In Leviticus, Jubilee was rooted in land. Fields rested, ancestral property returned, Israelite servants were released. The law was about preventing a household's temporary collapse from becoming permanent ruin. But in Greek-speaking Jewish thought, the language of release could now reach beyond fields and family holdings. It could speak of exile, oppression, sin, the condition of a people waiting for God to restore what had been broken. The old economic language was becoming a language of hope. And that brings us to one of the most famous scenes in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus enters the synagogue in Nazareth. He is handed the scroll of Isaiah. He reads words associated especially with Isaiah chapter 61. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to send out the oppressed in freedom, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then, according to Luke, he sits down and says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." That passage is loaded with Jubilee language. The phrase, "the year of the Lord's favour," echoes Isaiah's vision of divine restoration. And Isaiah itself draws on the language of release found in Leviticus. In the Greek version, the word appears again and again, aphesis, release for captives, freedom for the oppressed. But notice something important. Jesus does not stand up and announce a detailed 50-year land reform. He does not say, "Here is the schedule for returning every field." He does not issue a legal code for debt cancellation across the Roman Empire. Luke gives us a proclamation, not an administrative program. So what exactly is happening here? Scholars have debated that question for generations. Some argue that Luke presents Jesus as announcing a real social reversal. Good news for the poor was not merely a private feeling. In Luke's Gospel, wealth is dangerous, poverty matters, and the powerful are repeatedly warned that God's kingdom overturns ordinary status. The hungry will be filled, the rich may leave empty. The lowly are lifted up. From this perspective, Jubilee imagery carries economic force. It challenges systems that leave people trapped, excluded, indebted, or powerless. Other scholars emphasize the wider prophetic and messianic meaning. The captives may include people imprisoned by suffering, sin, demonic oppression, sickness, or exile from God. Release is not only financial, it is cosmic. It is the arrival of God's saving reign. And the most careful reading may be that Luke refuses to separate these worlds as neatly as we sometimes do. In the ancient world, debt, land loss, illness, social shame, political domination, and religious exclusion could all overlap in one person's life. A poor farmer did not experience hunger as merely economic. A captive did not experience freedom as merely spiritual. A person pushed to the edge of society needed more than a change of attitude. So when Luke uses the language of release, the word is broad enough to carry both realities. But broad does not mean simple. We should not claim that first-century Christians implemented the Jubilee law exactly as Leviticus describes it. The evidence does not show a Roman-wide return of ancestral land every 50 years. There is no clear record of churches operating a universal system of Jubilee, property restoration. What we do find is something different. The earliest Christian communities, at least in the idealized portrait preserved in Acts, placed extraordinary emphasis on shared resources. Acts says believers held possessions in common. Those with land or houses sometimes sold them and brought the proceeds to the community. The money was distributed according to need. The point was not that every Christian everywhere had abolished private property. Even within Acts, people still appear to own homes and possessions. And historians debate how widespread, how permanent, and how literal this communal practice was. But the moral direction is unmistakable. No one in the community was supposed to be abandoned in need. That is Jubilee logic, translated into a new setting. Not necessarily every family returns to its ancestral field, but we cannot allow a brother or sister to be crushed while others have abundance. The same pattern appears in later Christian teaching. Care for widows, orphans, strangers, prisoners, the sick, and the poor becomes central to Christian identity. Generosity is not presented as a side project for unusually kind people. It becomes evidence of belonging to a community shaped by God's mercy. And in the Roman world, that message had an edge. Rome was an empire of vast inequality. Great estates expanded, enslaved labour-powered agriculture, mines, households and trade. Cities depended on patronage, where the wealthy gave favours and the poor offered loyalty in return. Debt could still destroy households. Land could still concentrate in the hands of the powerful. Christian communities did not overthrow that system in the first century. They remained small, vulnerable, and often politically powerless. But they preserved a dangerous idea. Human beings are not disposable. Debt does not define a person forever. Wealth carries obligations, and freedom is not fully real if the poor are left without food, shelter, dignity, or hope. That is how Jubilee changed under Rome. Its original setting was the soil of Israel, the inheritance of clans, the rhythms of planting and harvest. But as Jewish and Christian writers carried its language into Greek cities and Roman provinces, it became larger than a calendar calculation. It became a moral vision of release, a messianic promise that God could restore captives, forgive debts, lift the poor and break powers that claimed permanence. And once Jubilee became attached to that kind of hope, it was no longer confined to the ancient fields of Leviticus. It was ready to travel into the medieval world where popes, pilgrims, kings, and millions of ordinary people would give the word Jubilee an entirely new life. And in the medieval world, that is exactly what happened. The word Jubilee did not disappear into the pages of Leviticus. It was taken up by the Latin Church, reshaped around pilgrimage, repentance, and the forgiveness of sins. The result was one of the most powerful religious institutions in European history. The first official Catholic Jubilee was proclaimed by Pope Boniface VIII for the year 1300. Picture the setting. Europe was deeply Christian, but it was not peaceful. Kingdoms fought wars, cities competed, disease and famine were never far away. Most people lived with uncertainty as a permanent condition. A bad harvest could mean hunger. A local lord could change your life. Death was close, and the fate of the soul after death was not an abstract theological question. It was the biggest question there was. Into that world came an extraordinary promise. Pilgrims who travelled to Rome, confessed their sins, repented, and visited the major basilicas could receive a plenary indulgence. In the Church's language, that meant remission of the temporal punishment believed to remain after sin had been forgiven. That distinction matters. An indulgence was not supposed to be permission to sin. It was not a magical coupon guaranteeing salvation. The official framework required confession, repentance, and a turning of the heart. But for ordinary medieval believers, the Jubilee offered something immense, a designated moment when divine mercy seemed especially near. A time to leave home, a time to cross mountains, rivers, and dangerous roads, a time to kneel at the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul, a time to seek release. Boniface VIII reportedly announced the Jubilee after hearing claims that Romans had long believed in a special remission every 100 years. Whether that supposed earlier custom was historically real is uncertain. The evidence is thin, but the response to the Pope's proclamation was very real. Crowds came to Rome from across Europe. They came from France, England, the Italian city-states, the German lands, Iberia, and places farther east. Rich pilgrims arrived with servants and horses. Poor pilgrims walked for weeks or months. Some came seeking forgiveness. Some came hoping for healing. Some came because everyone around them was talking about the year when Rome opened its spiritual treasury in a new way. The Jubilee turned the city into the centre of a vast Christian migration. But compare this carefully with Leviticus. In the biblical Jubilee, the central issue was land. Fields rested, ancestral holdings returned. Families pushed into poverty were protected from permanent dispossession. Israelite servants were released. The calendar was tied to agriculture, kinship, inheritance, and the dangerous tendency of wealth to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands. The Catholic Jubilee of 1300 was not that. No medieval pope ordered all European estates returned to their original families. No universal proclamation cancelled peasant debts. No 50-year land redistribution swept through Christendom. The powerful did not surrender their castles because a sacred calendar had arrived. Instead, the focus had moved. Jubilee was no longer primarily a reset of property relations. It had become a reset of the soul. The old language of release survived, but its centre of gravity changed. Release now meant forgiveness, remission, reconciliation with God. A fresh beginning for people burdened not only by debt to other human beings, but by sin, guilt, fear, and the imagined penalties of the world to come. And that adaptation was not random. Medieval Christianity had inherited centuries of biblical interpretation. It had absorbed the prophetic language of restoration. It had read Jesus' proclamation of the year of the Lord's favour through the lens of salvation history. By 1300, Jubilee could mean a sacred opening in time, a season when mercy was publicly announced and believers were called to respond. The 50-year pattern also returned, but not in the way Leviticus had imagined. Boniface VIII had set the first Jubilee at 100 years. That was a problem. Almost nobody could expect to attend more than one in a lifetime. Then came the Black Death. In 1348 and 1349, plague tore through Europe with terrifying speed. Entire households vanished. Cities lost enormous portions of their population. The old assumptions of security and continuity were shattered. In 1350, Pope Clement VI proclaimed another Jubilee, only 50 years after the first. 50 years. The number was close enough to the biblical pattern to carry symbolic weight, even though the institution itself remained fundamentally different. Clement's Jubilee gave a traumatized Christian world a formal season of penitence and hope. Rome was still struggling with political disorder, but the idea was too powerful to abandon. After that, the intervals kept changing. Some Jubilees were celebrated after 33 years, a number associated with the traditional age of Christ at his death. Others came after 25. In 1470, Pope Paul II established the interval that would become standard, a holy year every 25 years, so that more believers might have the chance to experience one during their lives. That is the key shift. The biblical Jubilee had been built around a long agricultural rhythm, 7 sabbatical cycles, then a 50th year. The Catholic Holy Year became more accessible, more frequent, and more centred on the spiritual needs of individuals and the institutional life of the Church. A sacred reset had become a recurring event, and it endured because people need designated moments of renewal. Most human beings know how easily life hardens. Grudges become permanent. Failures become identities. Institutions drift. Wealth concentrates. Violence becomes normal. People begin to assume that whatever exists now will exist forever. Jubilee interrupts that assumption. It says, no, there can be another beginning. In Leviticus, that beginning involved land, labour, family, and debt. In medieval Rome, it involved pilgrimage, confession, penance, and remission. The forms were radically different. The social consequences were not the same. But both drew power from a shared intuition. Time itself can be made moral. A society can set apart a moment and say, this is when we remember that possession is not absolute, failure is not final, and the past does not get the last word. That idea would not stay safely inside the walls of Rome. Soon, Jubilee language would collide with reformers, revolutionaries, economic radicals, and political movements that wanted not only forgiveness of sins but a much more literal resetting of the world. And once that idea escaped into politics, it became dangerous. Because a spiritual reset is one thing, a reset of land, debt, labour and power is something else entirely. During the Reformation, Europe was not simply arguing about theology. It was arguing about authority. Who had the right to interpret Scripture? Who could forgive sins? Who owed obedience to whom? And beneath those questions were older, harder questions about rent, taxes, common land, forced labour, and the widening distance between those who owned the world and those who worked it. The Bible became a weapon in those arguments. Reformers returned again and again to Scripture, insisting that no pope, bishop, or emperor stood above the Word of God. That did not mean they all embraced social revolution. Far from it. Martin Luther, the most famous reformer, attacked corruption in the church and challenged papal power, but he feared social disorder. When peasants in the German lands rose up in 1524 and 1525, demanding relief from oppressive dues and restrictions, Luther initially urged negotiation. But when the uprising turned violent, he condemned it in brutal terms. The peasants had their own reading of the Bible. Their famous 12 Articles did not call for a modern democracy. They did not demand that every form of property disappear. But they argued that rulers and lords had violated God's justice. They complained about excessive labour obligations, arbitrary fines, the seizure of common lands, and the denial of rights they believed had once been theirs. They wanted a world in which inherited privilege could be judged, not by custom, not by the wealth of a noble family, but by Scripture, conscience, and the common good. That is where Jubilee-like thinking enters the political imagination. Not always by name, not always as a literal demand to enforce Leviticus every 50 years, but through the same moral pressure. Can an old debt remain sacred forever? Can a family lose its land once, then lose it for generations? Can power become permanent simply because it has been powerful for a long time? For radical preachers such as Thomas Müntzer, the answer was no. Müntzer believed the Reformation had to go beyond correcting church abuses. He imagined a more sweeping transformation, one in which the godless powerful would be brought down and the humble lifted up. His language came from apocalyptic prophecy as much as from Jubilee. He expected God's kingdom to break into history, not politely, but with judgment. That distinction matters. Not every revolt was a Jubilee movement. Not every reformer wanted economic levelling, and the Bible itself was being read through many competing lenses: obedience, hierarchy, liberation, charity, divine wrath, communal order, private conscience. Still, the old language of release had a new political life. It gave ordinary people a vocabulary for saying that suffering was not inevitable, that ancient rights could be restored, that a social order built on extraction and humiliation might not be natural at all. A century later, similar currents appeared in England. The English civil wars shattered confidence in monarchy, church hierarchy, and inherited rank. In the chaos, movements with names like the Levellers and the Diggers began asking questions that sounded almost impossible. Why should political power belong mainly to property owners? Why should common land be fenced off for private gain? Why should people who worked the soil be denied the means to live from it? The Levellers argued for wider political participation and equality before the law. The Diggers went further. Led in part by Gerard Winstanley, they tried to cultivate unused common land, declaring that the earth should be a common treasury for all. Their experiment did not last. Local landowners and authorities shut it down. But the claim was unforgettable. The earth was not created for a small class to hold while everyone else begged for access. That was not a direct recreation of ancient Israel's Jubilee law. England was not ancient Israel, Its land system, legal traditions, economy, and religious conflicts were completely different. But the moral resemblance is hard to miss. Land was more than an investment. It was survival, and when land became concentrated, freedom itself became concentrated with it. Then came the age of revolution. By the late 18th century, the language changed again. In America, France, Haiti, and later across Europe and Latin America, revolutionaries spoke of liberty, equality, rights, citizenship, and the sovereignty of the people. Some drew deeply on biblical imagery. Others drew more heavily on Enlightenment philosophy, Roman republicanism, or the language of natural rights. They did not all agree on what a new beginning required. For some, revolution meant replacing a king with a constitution. For others, it meant abolishing feudal dues, redistributing land, ending slavery, dismantling aristocratic privilege, or remaking the calendar itself. Revolutionary France made that last impulse almost literal. In 1792, after overthrowing the monarchy, the revolutionaries declared a new era. They created a new calendar. Months were renamed. The old Christian framework of time was pushed aside. The years would now be counted from the birth of the Republic. Year 1. Imagine the confidence inside that phrase. The past had been judged. The old order had fallen. Time itself would begin again, but starting over is never clean. The French Revolution abolished many feudal privileges and opened paths toward a more equal legal order. It also produced political purges, mass violence, war, and eventually Napoleon's empire. A reset can release people from injustice. It can also unleash new forms of coercion, because somebody always has to decide what the new order will be. That is the enduring tension in Jubilee imagery. It can inspire compassion for the indebted, the dispossessed, and the excluded. It can remind societies that wealth and power are not morally self-justifying. It can challenge the idea that a bad beginning must become a permanent destiny. But it can also become a slogan for programs people fiercely oppose. Who deserves release? Who pays for it? What counts as stolen land, unjust debt, or illegitimate privilege? And can a society correct centuries of inequality without creating new injustice in the process? Those questions did not end with the Reformation or the revolutions. They only became more urgent as the modern economy created debts, fortunes, crashes, and inequalities on a scale the ancient world could barely imagine. And that is exactly what happened. The modern economy did not get rid of the ancient problem of debt. It industrialized it, it globalized it, it turned it into numbers moving through banks, stock exchanges, pension funds, credit cards, mortgage contracts, government bonds, and computer systems that can transfer billions of dollars before most people have finished breakfast. But underneath all that machinery, the pressure can look strangely familiar. Debt accumulates, assets concentrate. Those who own land, housing, businesses, shares, and productive resources can watch their wealth grow faster than wages. Those who borrow to survive, to buy a home, to get an education, to keep a business alive, or simply to make it through a bad year can fall further behind. And once that gap gets wide enough, the whole system starts to feel unstable. Think about debt for a moment. Debt is not automatically bad. A farmer borrows to buy equipment. A family borrows to buy a house. A business borrows to build a factory. A government borrows during war, disaster, or recession. Credit can connect today's need with tomorrow's expected income. It can build roads, fund inventions, and help people do things they could never pay for all at once. But debt makes one dangerous assumption: that tomorrow will be manageable, that income will continue, that prices will not collapse, that interest rates will not jump, that a drought, war, illness, layoff, crop failure, or financial panic will not arrive before the loan is repaid. When those assumptions fail for millions of people at the same time, debt stops being a private obligation. It becomes a social crisis. This is one reason reset ideas keep returning. Not because every society has secretly followed the biblical Jubilee calendar. Not because history runs like a clock set by heaven to ring every 50 years. But because economies repeatedly generate situations where old obligations collide with new reality. A debt that seemed reasonable 10 years ago can become impossible after a recession. A mortgage that seems safe can become crushing after wages stagnate and interest rates rise. A government loan can become unbearable after a currency collapses. A company that borrowed heavily in good times can suddenly face bankruptcy when demand disappears. And then somebody has to decide what happens next. In the modern world, one answer is bankruptcy. Bankruptcy does not mean that every debt simply vanishes and everybody walks away smiling. Usually it means a legal process. Assets may be sold. Creditors may take losses. Businesses may be reorganized. Individuals may be given a path to discharge some debts, while other obligations remain. It can be harsh, humiliating, and deeply unequal, depending on who has lawyers, collateral, and political influence. But the basic principle is important. There are times when forcing full repayment destroys more value than it saves. A business that can never repay may need to be restructured rather than liquidated. A household buried under impossible obligations may need a fresh start rather than permanent exclusion from economic life. Even lenders, in theory, benefit from a system that recognizes reality before the entire structure collapses. That sounds a little like Jubilee, but it is not Jubilee. Ancient Jubilee, at least in the ideal described in Leviticus, was not simply a bankruptcy court for people who had made bad financial decisions. It was tied to land, kinship, inheritance, labour, and the belief that the land ultimately belonged to God. Its purpose was to prevent permanent alienation. A family could suffer loss, but that loss was not supposed to become an eternal condition. Modern bankruptcy usually works differently. It is based on contracts, courts, creditors, and market rules. It may release debt without restoring land. It may protect some people while leaving others trapped. And it does not automatically challenge the wider distribution of wealth that created the crisis in the first place. Then there is debt restructuring. This is what happens when lenders and borrowers renegotiate, because the original terms no longer work. Payments may be delayed, interest rates may be lowered, part of the principal may be written off. Governments do this. Corporations do this. Banks do this. Sometimes households get relief too, though often only after enormous political pressure. Again, it is not Jubilee, but it reveals the same underlying truth. A debt is not sacred simply because it exists on paper. If repayment becomes impossible, somebody will absorb the loss. The only question is who? The borrower, the lender, taxpayers, workers through layoffs and wage cuts, or society as a whole through a wider economic crash. Inflation can function as another kind of partial reset. When prices rise, money loses purchasing power. That hurts people whose incomes do not keep up. It can devastate savers and workers, but it can also reduce the real burden of fixed debts. A loan taken out years earlier may become easier to repay if wages and prices rise, while the amount owed stays nominally the same. That does not make inflation a planned act of justice. Far from it. Inflation can be chaotic and unfair. It can wipe out household savings, destabilize economies, and punish people least able to protect themselves. But historically, it has often reduced debt burdens that no government was willing or able to cancel openly. Then come financial crises. The Panic of 1825, the Long Depression. The crash of 1929. The global financial crisis of 2008. Different countries, different institutions, different triggers. But a familiar pattern appears again and again. Credit expands during optimistic years. Asset prices rise. People assume the rise will continue. Borrowing increases. Speculation spreads. Then confidence breaks. And suddenly, the wealth that looks solid turns out to depend on promises. Promises that borrowers can pay. Promises that banks can honour withdrawals. Promises that property will keep rising. Promises that tomorrow will be better than today. When those promises fail together, governments and central banks often intervene. They guarantee deposits, rescue banks, cut interest rates, expand the money supply, rewrite rules. Sometimes they let institutions fail. Sometimes they protect them. Sometimes they protect ordinary borrowers. Often, critics argue, they protect the financial system first and the public later. This is where Jubilee language becomes politically explosive again. After a crisis, people look around and ask a simple question. Why are debts permanent when wealth is not? Why should a family lose its home while a giant bank receives emergency support? Why should students carry loans for decades while investors are rescued from reckless speculation? Why should one generation inherit assets and another inherit only interest payments? Those are not merely economic questions, they are moral questions. And they are very close to the pressure that made ancient release laws so powerful in the first place. Some thinkers have tried to explain these recurring pressures through long-wave theories of history. The most famous is often associated with Nikolai Kondratiev, a Russian economist who argued that capitalist economies might move through long cycles of expansion and contraction lasting roughly 40 to 60 years. Later writers linked similar waves to technological change, steam power, railways, electricity, automobiles, computers, and perhaps artificial intelligence. It is an attractive idea. A generation builds, investment surges, profits rise, competition intensifies, debt accumulates, growth slows, crisis clears the ground, then a new technological era begins. It sounds almost like an economic version of planting, harvesting, exhaustion, and renewal. But economists remain deeply divided over whether such regular long waves can really be identified. The problem is obvious. History is messy. Wars interrupt trends. Governments change policy. New technologies arrive unevenly. Data from earlier centuries is incomplete. And once people start looking for a 50-year rhythm, they can begin forcing events into the pattern. A recession after 47 years becomes close enough. A crisis after 58 years becomes basically 50. A recovery that does not fit gets ignored. That is not proof. That is pattern hunting. Economic recurrence is real. Booms and busts are real. Debt crises are real. Inequality can rise for decades and then provoke reform, collapse, inflation, taxation, revolution, or some combination of all five. But none of that demonstrates a divinely scheduled 50-year pattern. What it demonstrates is something both simpler and more unsettling. Human societies keep rediscovering the same problem. If wealth can compound indefinitely, if debt can survive indefinitely, and if access to land, housing, education, and political power becomes increasingly inherited, then the economy may keep producing people who are formally free but practically trapped. And eventually, trapped people start asking for release. Not always every 50 years. Not always peacefully. Not always under the name Jubilee, but often enough that the ancient idea refuses to disappear. And this is where the temptation becomes almost irresistible. Once you know that Jubilee is built around 50 years, and once you know that modern societies keep experiencing debt, crises, wars, political upheavals and cultural revolts, you start seeing 50s everywhere. 50 years from one war to another. 50 years from one market panic to the next. 50 years from one revolution to another. 50 years from a generation's idealism to its collapse into disillusionment. Look at the 20th century and the pattern can seem almost spooky. The First World War begins in 1914. About 50 years later, the world is deep in the Cold War. Empires are collapsing, civil rights movements are reshaping Western politics, and Vietnam is becoming a global crisis. Start instead with the crash of 1929. Roughly 50 years later, the late 1970s bring inflation, oil shocks, industrial decline, a crisis of confidence in old economic systems, and the rise of a new political order associated with deregulation, privatization, and global finance. Then move forward another generation. Around 2008, the global financial system nearly breaks. Housing markets collapse. Banks are rescued. Public trust fractures. Political movements on the left and right gain force. And a decade later, many countries are dealing with the consequences: polarization, populism, debt, inequality, distrust of institutions. That can look like a pattern. But now try a different starting point. Begin with 1917, the Russian Revolution. 50 years later brings 1967, anti-war protests, student uprisings, cultural rebellion, racial conflict, and a dramatic challenge to established authority in countries across the world. Start with 1945, the end of the Second World War. 50 years later takes you to 1995, when the Cold War has ended, the Internet age is accelerating, globalization is being celebrated, and the political mood in much of the West is almost the opposite of the crisis atmosphere of 1945. Start with 1968, often treated as the symbolic year of global revolt. 50 years later, in 2018, you find another wave of protests. New arguments over race, gender, nationalism, democracy, and wealth. Is that the same cycle repeating, maybe, or maybe 1968 and 2018 are such broad cultural labels that we can make almost anything fit inside them? That is the danger. History does not arrive neatly packaged in 50-year blocks. Events overlap, causes take decades to develop. A war may begin in 1 year, transform society over the next 10, and leave consequences for a century. An economic crisis may be visible to bankers before ordinary families feel it. A political realignment may start quietly in local elections long before historians give it a name. And the labels themselves are flexible. What counts as a war cycle? Do we count the beginning of a war, the end, the peace treaty, the first invasion, or the moment the public realizes everything has changed? What counts as a financial panic, a stock market crash, a banking failure, a recession, an inflation shock, a sovereign debt crisis? If you're allowed to choose the starting date after seeing the outcome, almost any interval can be made to look meaningful. This is confirmation bias. You notice the dates that support the pattern and forget the ones that do not. A crisis happens 49 years later. That feels close enough. Another happens 53 years later, also close enough. But a major event arrives 20 years later, or 70 years later, and suddenly it gets treated as an exception, a side story, or something outside the model. The pattern survives because the model keeps adjusting. Then there is survivorship bias. We remember the dramatic events that became textbooks chapters: 1929, 1945, 1968, 1989, 2008. But every decade contains shocks that once felt world-changing. Currency crises, regional wars, assassinations, labour struggles, elections, technological disruptions, pandemics. Some reshape the future. Some fade from collective memory. If we select only the famous moments, then connect them with a ruler marked in 50-year increments, the line can look far more precise than reality. But that does not mean all cyclical thinking is useless. There may be real rhythms in human societies, just not rhythms as clean as a cosmic clock. Generational turnover is one possibility. People who experience a great crisis in youth often carry its lessons for life. Those who remember depression, war, rationing, or dictatorship may build institutions designed to prevent those things from returning. They regulate banks, create welfare systems, form alliances, save more, trust stability over risk. Then time passes. The generation that remembers the disaster retires or dies. Their children inherit the institutions, but not always the fear that created them. The rules begin to look outdated. Caution begins to look inefficient. Debt seems manageable. Peace seems permanent. Markets seem self-correcting. And eventually the protections built after the last crisis may be weakened just before the next one arrives. That process does not require exactly 50 years. A generation is not a stopwatch. Some societies change faster. Some carry memory longer. Immigration, technology, education, war, and economic inequality can speed the process up or slow it down. Still, the rough interval is worth noticing. 50 years is long enough for direct memory to fade. Long enough for institutions to become routine. Long enough for children to inherit systems they did not build. And long enough for old risks to return wearing new clothes. So what would it take to show that a genuine 50-year cycle exists? Not a list of impressive dates, not a chart drawn after the fact, not vague claims that something big happens every half-century. A serious theory would need clear definitions before examining the evidence. It would need to say exactly what counts as a crisis, exactly which countries are included, and exactly how much variation is allowed. It would need to make predictions that could fail. If the theory says major banking crises should cluster every 50 years, then it must explain the ones that arrive early, late, or not at all. If it says political realignments follow a fixed rhythm, it must identify them before historians have the luxury of hindsight. And it must perform better than simpler explanations. Debt levels, demographic change, technological disruption, resource stress, military competition, bad policy, and plain human error. That is a high bar, maybe too high for history to ever behave like astronomy. But the mystery remains. The Jubilee number keeps pulling people back, because 50 years sits at the edge of human memory. It is long enough for wealth to compound, debts to harden, institutions to drift, and promises to be forgotten. Maybe history does not reset every 50 years. Maybe people do. And that raises the next problem. If someone wanted to calculate a modern Jubilee today, where exactly would they begin? And that simple question turns out to be much harder than it sounds. Because a Jubilee is not just 50 years on a calculator. Before you can count forward, you have to decide where the count begins. And almost every proposed modern Jubilee date depends on an answer that historians, rabbis, biblical scholars, and religious movements have debated for centuries. Some begin with creation. In later Jewish tradition, years are counted from a calculated date for the creation of the world. According to the standard Hebrew calendar, the year that began in the autumn of 2025 is 5,786. So someone might divide that number by 50, look for a remainder, and announce that a Jubilee is near. Sounds straightforward, but the creation date in that calendar is not an astronomical timestamp recovered from the beginning of time. It is a chronology constructed from biblical genealogies, reigns, and interpretive traditions. Other ancient Jewish, Christian, and Samaritan chronologies place creation at different points. Change the starting creation date, and every Jubilee calculation shifts with it. Others begin with the entry into the land. Leviticus connects the Jubilee to Israel's settlement. When you come into the land itself is to keep Sabbath. That leads some interpreters to start the count with the conquest traditions associated with Joshua. But here, the ground starts moving immediately. When exactly did the conquest happen? Was it a single event, as the biblical narrative can sound, or a long process of settlement over generations? Archaeologists and historians do not all date Israel's emergence in Canaan the same way. Some place key developments in the late 2nd millennium BCE. Others argue for a slower, more complicated formation of Israelite identity within Canaan itself. A difference of even 20 or 30 years at the beginning becomes a completely different Jubilee in the present. Then there are calculations anchored to the temple. Some count from the building of Solomon's temple, others from its destruction by Babylon in 586 BCE, others from the rebuilding of the Second Temple after the Exile. The temple matters because it became a central marker of sacred time. Kings were measured against it. Festivals were organized around it. National disaster was remembered through its loss. But even here, dates do not solve the problem. You still have to ask whether Jubilee counting continued during exile. Did it stop when the land was lost? Did it resume when some exiles returned? Was the count tied to the presence of all Israel in the land, to tribal inheritance, to a functioning sanctuary, or to some other condition? Later rabbinic discussions wrestle with exactly these questions. In rabbinic law, the Jubilee is often treated as dependent on conditions that no longer existed after the exile of the tribes and the breakdown of the old inheritance system. That means a modern claim to be calculating an active biblical Jubilee may be using a framework that later Jewish legal tradition itself did not always accept. And then comes the calendar problem. Modern people are used to years that begin on January 1st and last 365 days, with an extra day occasionally added in February. Ancient Israel did not use that system. Its religious calendar was lunisolar. Months followed the moon. But agricultural festivals had to remain in their proper seasons. Passover could not drift into winter forever, so extra months had to be inserted from time to time to bring lunar months back into alignment with the solar year. That is called intercalation, and it matters enormously. If you count 50 clean solar years from a modern date, you get one result. If you count 50 years in an ancient lunar solar system, with months adjusted by observation or later rules, you may get another. If the ancient calendar began in spring but your modern calculation begins in autumn, you may be off by half a year before the argument even starts. And there is an even deeper dispute. Was Jubilee the 50th year after 7 cycles of 7? Or was it effectively the 49th year, overlapping with the 7th Sabbatical year? Leviticus says to count 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, reaching 49 years. Then it says to consecrate the 50th year. That sounds clear until you try to put it on a repeating calendar. If Jubilee is a separate 50th year, then the next 7-year cycle begins after it. The rhythm becomes 49, then 50, then another 49. Over centuries, the count gradually moves away from a simple 7-year pattern. But if the Jubilee year overlaps with the 49th year, then every cycle remains neatly divisible by 7. That is mathematically elegant. It also changes every later date. One choice shifts the next Jubilee by a year. After 10 cycles, the difference can be 10 years. After 50 cycles, it can be half a century. This is why two people can both claim to be following the Bible, both cite ancient tradition, both use detailed charts, and still announce Jubilee years decades apart. So, when you see a confident modern prediction, pause before accepting the number. Ask, what is the anchor date? Creation? The conquest? Solomon's temple? The exile? The return? a rabbinic chronology, the beginning of a modern state. Ask, which calendar is being used? Solar years, lunar years, a reconstructed ancient Hebrew calendar. The modern fixed Hebrew calendar ask, is Jubilee counted as year 49 or year 50? Ask whether the calculation assumes an unbroken count through periods when the land was conquered, divided, exiled, repopulated, and ruled by foreign empires. And finally, ask the most important question. Is this an established historical chronology, or is it an interpretation built from uncertain starting points? That does not make the search meaningless. It makes it human. People want a date because dates feel solid. They turn a moral vision into a deadline. They make the ancient promise of release feel close enough to circle on a calendar. But Jubilee may be more difficult than that. Maybe its power was never in telling people exactly when history would reset. Maybe its power was in demanding that they refuse to wait for history to do it on its own. And that brings us back to the part of Jubilee that may matter most. Not the date, not the calculation, not whether you can draw a perfect line from ancient Israel to a year on a modern calendar. The blueprint. Because whatever we conclude about its historical observance, the Jubilee laws preserve a startling idea. A society can organize itself around the assumption that neither land nor people should be used up forever. Think about what that meant in an ancient farming world. Land was not just property, it was survival. It was food, shelter, family continuity, and the difference between independence and desperation. If your fields failed for several years, you did not simply lose an investment. You could lose your future. You might borrow grain, then borrow money, then sell part of your land, then sell your labour. And eventually your children could inherit not a secure household, but a chain of obligations they never created. Jubilee confronted that nightmare directly. The land was supposed to rest. Fields were not to be planted or harvested in the normal commercial way. What grew on its own could be shared. The point was not that farming was bad. The point was that endless extraction had limits. That sounds ancient. But it is also strangely modern. Modern agriculture can produce astonishing amounts of food. But it can also exhaust soil, drain aquifers, clear forests, destroy pollinator habitats, and turn fertile ground into something closer to dust. For generations, industrial systems have often treated land as if it were a machine. Add fertilizer, remove crops, repeat forever. But soil is not a machine. It is a living system. It contains minerals, fungi, bacteria, insects, roots, water, and organic matter built up over centuries. Strip it too aggressively, and the consequences may not show up in one season. They emerge slowly: erosion, falling yields, salinization, rivers carrying topsoil away, groundwater sinking deeper every year. A landscape that still looks productive until suddenly it isn't. The sabbatical year behind Jubilee recognized something basic. Rest is not the opposite of productivity. Sometimes rest is what makes productivity possible in the first place. Now, nobody is suggesting that a modern city should literally stop all economic activity every 7th year, or that a global food system can be managed by copying an Iron Age farming code word for word. Ancient Israel was an agrarian society with a different population, technology, economy, and legal structure. But adaptation is not the same as dismissal. The question is whether the principle still holds. Can we build food systems that replenish soil instead of merely extracting from it? Can forests, fisheries, water supplies, and mineral reserves be treated as inheritances held in trust rather than piles of material to be consumed before someone else gets there? Can an economy measure success not only by how much it produces this quarter, but by whether the land will still support life 50 years from now? That is Jubilee thinking, and the social side may be even more uncomfortable. Jubilee assumed that misfortune could trap people. A failed harvest, an injury, a death in the family, a bad loan, a season of drought. None of these things necessarily meant someone was lazy, foolish, or morally defective. But in a system without protection, one disaster could become permanent. Debt could turn into loss of land could turn into dependence. Dependence could pass from parents to children. That is why the Jubilee vision placed limits on permanent accumulation. Not because every household would end up equal. The biblical text does not describe a world without differences in skill, effort, luck, or wealth. But it does resist the idea that wealth should be allowed to harden into permanent control over other people's futures. Look at the modern parallels. Housing insecurity, families priced out of neighbourhoods where they grew up, investors buying homes faster than ordinary workers can save for a deposit, predatory lending that turns a temporary shortage into years of impossible payments, student debt, medical debt, payday loans, gig workers with no reliable hours, no benefits, and no protection when work disappears. These are not identical to ancient debt slavery. The differences matter. But the underlying question is familiar. At what point does an economic system stop rewarding effort and start converting vulnerability into a lifelong sentence? Jubilee does not give us a simple policy manual. It does not tell a modern government exactly how to structure bankruptcy, rent control, land taxes, labour law, debt relief, public housing, or environmental regulation. People who claim it does are usually skipping over thousands of years of historical change. But it does force a moral question that remains painfully clear. What does a society owe people who are trapped by misfortune? Not people who made no mistakes. No human system contains people like that. People whose mistakes, illnesses, losses, or bad timing have become so expensive that escape is no longer realistic. Do we tell them that the market has spoken? Or do we decide that no debt, no landlord, no employer, no institution, and no generation should have unlimited power over the future of another human being? That is the enduring force of Jubilee. It imagines that the rules of society are not laws of nature. They were made, which means they can be remade. A debt can be forgiven. Land can be protected. A worker can be given security. A family can be allowed to begin again, and maybe that is the real reset hidden inside the ancient law. Not a cosmic clock that automatically rescues us every 50 years. A demand that human beings build systems capable of release before desperation becomes destiny. So what can the Jubilee blueprint actually tell us about the future? First, it tells us something historical. Jubilee was not originally a prediction system. It was not a coded calendar for forecasting wars, market crashes, elections, revolutions, or the end of the world. In Leviticus it appears as part of a sacred social order. Time belonged to God. Land ultimately belonged to God. Israelite households were tenants, not absolute owners. And because no human being owned the land, no human being was supposed to be permanently crushed by losing access to it. That is the core idea. After 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year was to be proclaimed as a time of release. Land that had passed out of a family's hands was to return. Israelites who had sold their labour because of poverty were to go free. The price of land was supposed to reflect how many harvests remained before the next Jubilee, because what was really being sold was not the earth itself, but temporary use of its produce. Whether ancient Israel carried this out exactly as the text describes is much harder to establish. The evidence is incomplete. The Bible presents the law clearly, but surviving records do not give us a neat list of observed Jubilee years, land returns, debt cancellations, and freed servants stretching across centuries. Later Jewish communities debated how these laws applied. Prophets invoked release and restoration. Priests and scribes preserved calendars and sacred cycles. But a fully documented, continuously observed 50-year system remains beyond what the evidence can prove. And that uncertainty matters. It means we should be careful when someone claims to have discovered the master Jubilee timetable behind all of history. A theory can be fascinating without being demonstrated. Once people start searching for 50-year intervals everywhere, the pattern can become almost impossible not to find. History is crowded with wars, crashes, breakthroughs, scandals, migrations, elections, famines, and revolutions. Pick enough starting dates, shift by a few years, choose the events that fit, ignore the ones that do not, and almost any number can begin to look prophetic. 50 years before this crisis, 50 years after that revolution. 50 years between one financial panic and another. Sometimes the resemblance is real, but resemblance is not causation. A number on a calendar does not explain why empires expand, why governments collapse, why debts become unbearable, why new technologies disrupt old jobs, or why people decide they have had enough. Those events have causes: political decisions, resource shortages, military power, disease, demography, climate, ideology, fear, ambition, and the choices of ordinary people who may never have heard the word Jubilee. There is no credible evidence that world history is controlled by a hidden biblical clock that resets every 50 years. But here is the twist. The absence of that clock does not make Jubilee irrelevant. It may make the idea more challenging, because if history is not going to reset itself for us, then restoration has to be chosen. Think about what the biblical law was doing. It was taking a danger that every society creates over time and placing a limit on it. Wealth accumulates, land consolidates, debt compounds, temporary emergencies become permanent disadvantages. A family falls behind, then falls further behind, until the future itself starts to look privately owned by someone else. Jubilee interrupts that process, not by pretending that consequences do not exist, not by declaring that every decision has the same outcome, but by refusing to let hardship become hereditary forever. It says that the normal operation of an economy can produce results that are socially intolerable. And if those results are intolerable, a community has the right, maybe even the duty, to intervene. That is why the idea keeps returning. It returns in ancient proclamations of debt release, in prophetic visions of return from exile, in Christian language about forgiveness and liberty, in medieval holy years, in campaigns for land reform, bankruptcy protections, labour rights, debt relief, and environmental restoration. Each movement is different. Some use Jubilee language carefully. Others use it loosely. Some are religious, some are not. But they keep arriving at the same pressure point. How much accumulation is too much? How long should a debt survive? When does ownership become domination? And what do we owe the people who inherit a society shaped by decisions they never made? That is the future-facing power of Jubilee, not that it gives us the date of the next reset. It gives us a way to recognise when a reset is needed. Maybe history does repeat, not because a cosmic counter reaches 50, but because human beings keep rebuilding the same traps. We concentrate wealth. We treat nature as limitless. We turn emergency measures into permanent systems. We allow the fortunate to call their fortune virtue, and the desperate to call their desperation failure. Then eventually pressure builds, anger builds, ecological damage builds, debt builds, and people begin demanding release. Or maybe history repeats because societies live inside stories. Stories about what property means. Stories about who deserves a second chance. Stories about whether the world is a marketplace, an inheritance, a battlefield, or a shared home. Jubilee is one of the oldest and most radical of those stories. It imagines a world in which no arrangement is so permanent that it cannot be questioned. So the ancient Jubilee remains two things at once. It was an institution rooted in the land laws, religious imagination, and social tensions of ancient Israel. And it is an unfinished question, still waiting for every generation to answer. When power accumulates, who restores the balance? When the future is being sold off piece by piece, who declares release? And if no sacred calendar forces us to begin again, will we choose to do it before the damage becomes irreversible? Maybe that is the real meaning of a world that resets. Not a world where some hidden mechanism wipes the slate clean every 50 years. Not a world where history follows a secret code and all we have to do is find the right starting date, count forward, and wait for the next crisis to arrive. A reset in the Jubilee sense was never supposed to be automatic. It was a decision. A society looked at the passage of time and recognized something dangerous. Land changes hands, debt grows, families lose security. The powerful gain more power, not always because they are uniquely evil, but because systems tend to reward whoever already has the most room to maneuver. One bad harvest becomes a loan. The loan becomes lost land. Lost land becomes lost independence, and eventually inequality stops being an event and becomes an inheritance. Jubilee was an attempt to interrupt that inheritance. That is where this journey began, in Leviticus, with 7 cycles of 7 years leading toward a 50th year of release. Land was not meant to be permanently alienated. Labour was not meant to become permanent bondage. Even the soil was given rest. The whole system rested on an idea that sounds almost shocking in a world built around permanent ownership. The land was not ultimately theirs to own. They lived on it. They worked it. They passed it to their children. But they were, in the deepest sense, caretakers inside a larger order. From there the idea travelled through debates over sabbatical years and sacred calendars, through prophets speaking the language of liberty, return and restoration, through communities trying to map divine time onto the chaos of history, through medieval holy years, political revolutions, debt relief movements, and modern attempts to discover 50-year patterns in wars, markets, and social change. And that is where we have to keep our footing. Jubilee is historically real as an ancient biblical idea. The text exists. Its laws are detailed. Its influence across Jewish and Christian thought is undeniable. But the exact way it was practiced in ancient Israel and the exact chronology of later Jubilee calculations remain debated. The evidence does not give us a perfectly measured, uninterrupted line of 50-year observances stretching from the ancient world into the present, and it certainly does not prove that every major event in history is controlled by a hidden Jubilee clock. That claim can be compelling, sometimes eerily compelling. 50 years is long enough for generations to change, debts to mature, institutions to harden, and memories of the last disaster to fade. So yes, patterns can appear, but patterns are not automatically laws. History is made by people, pressures, institutions, accidents, and choices. A calendar may help us organize the past. It cannot replace an explanation of the past. But maybe the fascination with resets tells us something important anyway. Maybe societies need deliberate moments when they stop and ask, what has become too concentrated? What burden has become too heavy? What damage have we normalized because it happened slowly enough? Who has been locked out of the future? Because without some form of renewal, every system risks becoming a machine that converts yesterday's advantage into tomorrow's destiny. The ancient Jubilee did not promise a painless world. It offered something harder, a world where permanence had limits, a world where release could be proclaimed, a world where the future was not allowed to belong entirely to the people who had already won. So what do you think? Do you see meaningful cycles in history, or do we see cycles because human societies keep repeating the same mistakes? And if a modern Jubilee were possible, what would it look like? Debt relief? Land reform? Ecological restoration? A new social guarantee that no family can fall permanently beyond recovery? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you are listening from. If this journey changed the way you see history, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. And the best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Because perhaps the deepest lesson of Jubilee is this: a better world does not arrive because the calendar says it is time. It arrives when people decide that what has been broken does not have to stay broken forever.